Sherlock Holmes and the Opal of Wight, from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle in style. Chapter 1's A Shadow Across the Thames. It was the 15th of April, 1893, and a heavy fog clung to the streets of London like an ancient curse. The city had long since awoken, but its breath seemed sluggish, weighed down by the mist that obscured even the largest gas lamps, casting a dim glow over the cobbled lanes. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoed from the far-off streets, and the muffled hum of commerce filled the air as traders, dock workers, and factory hands went about their business. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual chair by the window of 21B Baker Street. His thin fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his piercing gaze fixed on the swirling mists that roiled beneath the gaslights outside. His ever-present companion, Dr. John Watson, had just returned from a morning appointment at the St. Bartholomew's Hospital and was now lounging in his chair, reading the day's edition of the Times. As was often the case, Watson was thoroughly engrossed in his task, while Holmes appeared to be in deep contemplation. "Holmes," Watson ventured, his voice breaking the silence, "I dare say it's another dreary day. Not a soul to be seen in the fog." Holmes' gaze remained fixed on the shifting shadows outside. He didn't answer immediately, but allowed the tension to build before he turned his keen eyes toward his friend. "There is, Watson," he said in his slow, deliberate voice. "Something brewing in the city today. Something that involves much more than the fog and the mist. I have been expecting a visitor, and it seems we are finally to be graced with their presence." Watson raised an eyebrow but said nothing, curious as to where Holmes' deductions might lead. As if on cue, a sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. "Come in," Holmes called, his voice now a controlled blend of curiosity and expectancy. The door opened slowly, revealing a tall figure, stiff and military in bearing. He wore the distinctive uniform of an army officer, his cap tucked beneath his arm, his posture rigid as though the weight of the world was upon him. His face, though young, was set in a grim expression that spoke of great hardship. His eyes, dark and haunted, glanced quickly between the two men. "Captain James Blackwood, at your service," the officer said, his voice deep and measured, with a slight quiver of stress underneath. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Holmes stood up from his chair with a swift motion, his sharp eyes sizing up the visitor. "Please, Captain, take a seat," he said, gesturing to the armchair near the hearth. "Watson, fetch the man some tea." As Watson hurried to obey, Holmes settled into his own chair, watching intently as the officer removed his gloves and sat with an air of discomfort. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with anticipation, and it wasn't long before Captain Blackwood spoke again. "It is, I believe, Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes to whom I am speaking," he said, his voice tightening. "I have come to seek your help." Holmes inclined his head slightly, urging the captain to continue. I am in dire need of assistance, and I find myself unsure of whom else to turn to," Blackwood began. "The matter concerns something very precious, and something stolen. A gem, Mr. Holmes, a rare and extraordinary gem. The Opal of Wight." At this, Watson's interest piqued, and he set the teacup down with a slight clink, his gaze turning toward Holmes. "The Opal of Wight," Holmes repeated, his voice cold but tinged with intrigue. "I am familiar with its history. A treasure of great value, one of the largest opals ever discovered, and a jewel so rare that it has been the subject of much interest among collectors." Blackwood nodded solemnly. "Indeed, it was being transported from India to London, where it was to be presented to Her Majesty. I was entrusted with its safekeeping. And you've come to tell me it has been stolen?" Holmes interjected, his sharp mind already working through the potential implications. "Yes," Blackwood said, his hands tightening into fists on his lap. "I was the courier and I was in charge of the gem's delivery. But I failed in my duty. It was stolen, and I was left drugged and robbed. I woke to find myself in the streets of London, alone and disoriented. I know not how I came to be in that condition. I fear foul play, and I fear that my name will be dragged through the mud for something I did not do." Holmes' gaze never wavered from the officer's face, his mind calculating the truth behind the man's words. He had heard similar stories before, tales of men who had been drugged, tricked, or outright deceived into participating in a crime. But this felt different. The captain's distress seemed genuine, and there was a nervous energy in his movements that Holmes found telling. "Tell me, Captain Blackwood," Holmes asked, his voice measured, "where exactly was the opal last seen, and how do you come to be in the condition you describe?" Blackwood hesitated for a moment before answering, his eyes darting to the side. "The gem was last seen aboard the steamship Viceroy, which had made port at the London docks early this morning. I was to retrieve it from the ship, but I remember nothing after meeting a man, someone who seemed familiar. He spoke of a business deal, and I believed him. Then I lost consciousness." Holmes's mind raced. There was much to consider. The notion of a man of Blackwood's rank and reputation being so easily deceived seemed far-fetched, and yet the circumstances were oddly specific. The steamship, the docks, the encounter with a man who seemed too familiar. "You said something about a business deal," Holmes continued, leaning forward slightly. "Can you recall any further details?" "I cannot," Blackwood admitted, his voice breaking with frustration. "It all came to me in fragments. I am convinced that there is someone behind this, someone who has been watching me, manipulating the entire situation from the start. But who would benefit from such a crime?" Holmes remained silent for a moment, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. As he did, Watson spoke up, his face thoughtful. "The docks, Holmes," Watson said. "A seedy part of London, isn't it? That's where things often go awry." Holmes nodded slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Indeed, Watson. And I suspect that the opal's disappearance is no mere robbery. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme, one designed not only to steal a priceless gem, but to send a message." "A message?" Blackwood echoed, his brow furrowing in confusion. Holmes rose from his chair and began pacing the room, his long strides punctuating the quiet tension in the air. "Captain, this jewel is far more than a rare gem. It is a symbol, one of immense power and value. Whoever has stolen it is likely involved in a scheme much larger than mere theft. I suspect we are dealing with a conspiracy, one that reaches far beyond your understanding, and its goal may very well be to finance a rebellion in the colonies." "Rebellion?" Watson said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You think this gem is linked to such a thing?" Holmes paused, turning to face them both. "It is not just a gem, Watson. It is a key to a treasure trove of wealth that could fund such a rebellion, and we must act swiftly, for if we do not, it will be too late to stop whatever it is they have planned." Blackwood's face had grown pale as the implications of Holmes's words sank in. "But what can I do? I am a soldier, not a detective." "You will do exactly as I say, Captain," Holmes replied coldly. "We will find this opal, and we will uncover the men behind its theft. I suggest you trust me, for I am your only hope in seeing this matter resolved." As the fog outside thickened, and the sun's feeble light struggled to break through the haze, Sherlock Holmes had already begun plotting the first steps of his investigation, steps that would lead him from the finest drawing rooms of London to the darkest alleys of the East End, where a sinister conspiracy awaited discovery. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer as Holmes' words settled over them. The ticking of the clock on the mantel, a solitary witness to the growing tension. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the room, but the cold still clung to the air, creeping into the bones of those gathered there. Holmes resumed pacing with an almost predatory energy, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind a whirlwind of deduction. He halted abruptly, turning to face Captain Blackwood. "You said the Viceroy docked early this morning. Did you see who else was aboard?" Holmes asked sharply, his voice cutting through the thickening fog of the room like a blade. Blackwood hesitated, his brow furrowing as he sifted through his memory. I did not see anyone in particular," he said, his voice growing softer. The ship was bustling with activity, sailors unloading crates, merchants checking their cargo. It was chaotic. But there was a man who approached me as I was preparing to board. "A man?" Holmes pressed, narrowing his eyes. "And what of him?" Blackwood's hands twitched nervously in his lap, his gaze momentarily distant as though he were trying to recall something buried deep in his mind. He seemed out of place. His clothes were fine, perhaps too fine for a man of his apparent station. He had a manner about him that was unsettling. He spoke with an air of authority, but his accent was strange, foreign, yet not quite Indian. More European, perhaps. European? Watson interjected. You mean he wasn't British? Not entirely, Blackwood answered, his voice low. His mannerisms, too, were foreign. He spoke quickly, as if he was afraid someone might overhear. Holmes's brow furrowed as he absorbed the captain's words. Did this man say anything of importance? Nothing of consequence, Blackwood muttered, rubbing his temples as if trying to clear away the fog that had settled in his mind. He mentioned a business arrangement, something about ensuring the Opal's delivery was discreet. I did not think much of it at the time. I simply assumed it was a matter of protocol. Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a man who had already seen the beginnings of a puzzle. Watson, I believe we are dealing with a criminal of some sophistication. This man knew exactly how to manipulate Captain Blackwood into believing his story. The theft was not merely an opportunistic robbery, it was orchestrated. Captain Blackwood's face hardened at Holmes' words, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. You're suggesting that someone set me up? I am suggesting, Captain, that you were the intended pawn in a much larger scheme, Holmes replied, his tone calm but resolute. But we will uncover the players behind this, and more importantly, the larger game they are playing. Holmes turned back toward the window, his gaze drifting out into the fog that obscured the streets below. The city, it seemed, was hiding its secrets, just as it had so many times before. But today, it was not just the city's hidden corners that beckoned to Holmes. It was the web of intrigue that stretched across the very heart of the empire. I will need every detail, Captain, Holmes said, his voice no longer a request, but a command. Who were the men in charge of overseeing the gem's transportation? Who could have known of its arrival in London? Blackwood blinked, startled by the sudden turn of the conversation, but he quickly composed himself. The shipment was handled by Lord Wentworth's estate. He is a well-known jewel merchant, one of the wealthiest men in London. He was the one who secured the gem's transport from India. I met with him before the voyage, and I was instructed to keep the Opal under strict lock and key until it reached the capital. Lord Wentworth, Holmes murmured, tasting the name on his tongue. A man of influence and wealth, no doubt. He may very well hold the key to understanding the larger motives behind this theft. I will pay him a visit this afternoon. Blackwood's eyes widened. Do you think he is involved? Holmes did not immediately answer, his mind already running through possible scenarios. I do not believe that Lord Wentworth is directly involved, but it is clear that someone within his network may be. Perhaps he was unaware of the plot to steal the Opal. Or perhaps... Holmes paused, his lips curling into a faint smile. Perhaps he is the one who stands to gain the most from its disappearance. Do you believe Lord Wentworth is behind this? Watson asked, his voice a mix of concern and curiosity. Holmes took a moment before replying, his eyes narrowing slightly. It is too early to make such an accusation, Watson, but I find it interesting that such a powerful figure would choose to involve a respected military officer in the transportation of a precious jewel. Captain Blackwood's presence may have been a precaution, someone to act as a scapegoat in the event that things went awry. Blackwood's face went pale at Holmes's, words the weight of the suggestion settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. You think I was chosen to take the fall? I think, Captain, that your involvement is part of a carefully crafted plan, Holmes replied coolly. But we must confirm this with evidence. With that, Holmes turned back to Blackwood. I suggest you accompany me to Lord Wentworth's estate. We will see if he can shed any light on this matter. The captain nodded grimly, standing up from his seat. I will do whatever it takes, Mr. Holmes. I just need to clear my name. Holmes gave a small nod of acknowledgement and turned back toward Watson, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, his brow furrowed in thought. Watson, Holmes said briskly, you shall accompany us as well. Lord Wentworth will likely be more forthcoming with a familiar face in the room. Watson nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a rising sense of unease. This case was spiraling in directions he hadn't expected, and Holmes's sense of anticipation only added to the feeling that they were about to plunge headfirst into a much darker mystery. As the three men prepared to leave the comfort of 221B Baker Street, Holmes stopped for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room once more. The fog outside seemed to have thickened, and the air in the room grew colder, as though it too was waiting for something to happen. "This is no ordinary theft, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and deliberate. "The Opal of Wight is but a symbol. The true prize lies in the secrets it guards, and the game we are about to enter is one that could shake the very foundations of the Empire." With that, they exited the flat, stepping into the fog-filled streets of London, where the shadows had already begun to stir, waiting to reveal the first clue in the chase for the Opal of Wight. Chapter 2. Lord Wentworth's Secret. The fog outside thickened, swirling through the streets of London like a living thing, veiling the city in an otherworldly mist. The cobblestone paths were slippery, the gas lamps casting long, faint shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly in the darkness. It was a cold, damp afternoon, a typical London day in late November, where the chill sank into your bones and the air felt heavy with secrets. Holmes, Blackwood, and Watson moved swiftly through the streets, the rhythmic click of their boots on the stone roads, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Watson had his coat buttoned tightly around him, his breath fogging in the air as they made their way to Lord Wentworth's estate, a grand townhouse nestled in the heart of London's West End. The merchant's residence was a testament to his wealth and status, a towering structure of red brick and ivy, its facade adorned with elaborate carvings of knights and coats of arms. As they approached the tall iron gates that guarded the estate, Holmes turned to Captain Blackwood with a calculating look. "Captain, remember that our objective is to glean as much information as possible without raising suspicions. Lord Wentworth may not be directly involved, but he is undoubtedly connected to those who are. Keep your wits about you." Blackwood, looking slightly paler than before, nodded sharply. "Understood. I'll remain silent unless spoken to. My presence here may be unsettling." Holmes gave a brief but reassuring smile before turning toward the gate. A butler, dressed in a dark livery, opened the door with a well-practiced formal motion and ushered them inside. The atmosphere of the estate was one of quiet opulence. The halls were lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow the group as they made their way into the drawing room. Lord Wentworth's study, which was located at the end of a long, narrow corridor, was the epitome of aristocratic taste. Mahogany shelves filled with leather-bound books, marble busts of famous philosophers, and a large, imposing fireplace. A fire crackled within, throwing shadows across the walls and creating a warm contrast to the coldness that clung to the outside world. A grand velvet armchair was placed beside the hearth, where Lord Wentworth himself sat, his back straight and his hands resting on the armrests, as though waiting for them. The merchant, a man in his late 50s with a high forehead and a pair of sharp, calculating eyes, rose as the men entered, his movements smooth and controlled. He was dressed in an elegant waistcoat of deep burgundy, with a silk cravat tied neatly at his neck, and his silvering hair was combed to perfection. "Mr. Holmes, Captain Blackwood, Dr. Watson," Lord Wentworth greeted them, his voice rich with authority and politeness, though there was something guarded in his eyes. "I trust you had no trouble finding your way here?" "Not at all, Lord Wentworth," Holmes replied smoothly, his voice carrying the unspoken command of a man accustomed to being listened to. "I am grateful for your time. We would not have called upon you were the matter not urgent." Lord Wentworth raised an eyebrow at this, his expression unreadable. "Urgent, you say? What business could the famed Sherlock Holmes have with a simple jewel merchant like myself?" Holmes studied him for a long moment, noting the subtle shift in Wentworth's posture, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, as if he were suppressing an urge to smile. "I am here concerning the recent theft of the Opal of Wight, which was being transported under your care from India. I believe Captain Blackwood was entrusted with its safe passage." Wentworth's face shifted, just a flicker, but it was enough. "Ah, the opal," he murmured. "A prized possession, certainly. So, I trust Captain Blackwood is in good health despite the unfortunate events." "Yes, thank you," Blackwood interjected. "Captain, please," Holmes cut him off gently, his eyes never leaving Wentworth's. "The opal, my lord. We are trying to ascertain how it was stolen and whether any of your associates may have been involved." Wentworth's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. As I told Captain Blackwood, the Opal was to be delivered under strict orders and with full insurance coverage. I am not in the habit of losing valuable assets, Mr. Holmes. Surely you do not suspect me of complicity in this matter?" Holmes smiled, the faintest trace of irony curling his lips. "I suspect nothing, my lord. I am merely gathering facts. You must understand that this opal is not just a gem. It is part of a much larger picture, and I believe you may be in a position to help us see it more clearly." The words hung in the air like a delicate thread, waiting to be pulled. Wentworth's face was impassive, but Holmes could see the muscles in his jaw tighten just a fraction. He had touched a nerve. "Perhaps I could assist you," Wentworth said after a long pause, his voice smooth again, though with a hint of something. Unease, perhaps. "But I must be clear. I am a businessman, Mr. Holmes. My interests lie in commerce, not in matters of criminal intrigue. I merely brokered the sale of the opal to a collector who desired it for his private collection." "Ah, a collector," Holmes replied, his tone casual but with a sharp edge. "And who might that be?" Wentworth hesitated, his eyes darting momentarily to a small desk beside him, where several letters were neatly arranged. "I'm afraid I cannot divulge the identity of my client. That would be unseemly." "I see," Holmes replied, his tone cool, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It seems that discretion is key in your line of work, my lord. But perhaps you could enlighten me as to your relationship with a certain individual, a man by the name of George Lefebvre. Does that name mean anything to you?" At the mention of Lefebvre's name, Wentworth's demeanor shifted subtly, his gaze becoming guarded. He stood, moving toward the fireplace with deliberate slowness, as though trying to gather his thoughts. "Georges Lefebvre?" Wentworth repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "I do not see how this concerns him. He is a mere acquaintance, a Frenchman involved in certain financial matters in the colonies. Nothing more." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Financial matters in the colonies? You wouldn't happen to be financing any political projects, would you, my lord? I've heard whispers of unrest in India, of men seeking to break free from the shackles of the empire." Lord Wentworth's eyes flared for the briefest moment, his lips tightening into a thin line. "I am a businessman, Mr. Holmes. I deal in goods, not revolutions." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "Of course," he finally said, his voice measured. "But I would be remiss if I did not ask, how closely do you associate with men like Lefebvre, men whose interests lie in the upheaval of the status quo? If the opal was intended as more than just a treasure, I think it is safe to say that you may have unwittingly found yourself involved in a far darker conspiracy than you realize." Wentworth's face was a mask of calm now, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the glass of brandy on the table beside him. "I think, Mr. Holmes, that you have gone too far with your accusations. My role in this affair is that of a simple merchant, nothing more." Holmes held Wentworth's gaze, unfazed by the merchant's sudden defensiveness. "I would advise you, my lord, to reconsider your position. You may find that the web of deceit surrounding this theft is far wider and more dangerous than you have anticipated." The tension in the room was palpable as Wentworth held Holmes' gaze for a moment longer before lowering his eyes. With a slow nod, he conceded, albeit begrudgingly. "I shall think on what you have said, Mr. Holmes," Wentworth said, his voice laced with reluctance. "But I trust you understand that I can offer you no more information on this matter." Holmes gave a small, polite nod. "Of course, my lord. I will take my leave now, but I have no doubt that this conversation will not be the last." As they turned to leave, Watson caught a fleeting glance from Wentworth's eyes. Something calculated, something hidden behind the facade of a respectable merchant. Watson's gut twisted with the feeling that they had only just begun to uncover the tip of a very dangerous iceberg. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the East End. The fog had thickened further by the time Holmes, Watson, and Captain Blackwood emerged from Lord Wentworth's imposing townhouse, the cold biting at their faces as they stepped back into the streets of London. The sound of carriage wheels echoed distantly, muffled by the heavy mist, and the lanterns flickered with an eerie uncertainty, casting faint pools of light that barely pierced the haze. The city felt more like a labyrinth than ever, a winding maze where secrets clung to every corner. Holmes strode ahead, his steps purposeful and confident, but Watson could see the deep lines of thought furrowing his brow. Blackwood, unusually quiet, trailed behind, the weight of the earlier conversation with Lord Wentworth heavily on his shoulders. "What do you make of Wentworth, Holmes?" Watson asked, breaking the silence as they navigated the cobbled streets. Holmes adjusted his coat, his eyes scanning the fog, as though it were just another piece in the puzzle. "Lord Wentworth is a man who knows how to conceal his intentions, Watson. He's a master of polite deflection, but beneath that veneer lies something far more complex. There's a connection to George Lefebvre, whether he admits it or not. And there's a reason he was so defensive when we mentioned political matters. His investments are likely tied to forces working in the colonies, forces that would benefit from the unrest in India." Watson nodded, though he was still puzzled. But why would Wentworth involve himself in something so dangerous? It seems out of character for a man of his stature. Holmes shot him a quick glance, his eyes sharp. "Power, Watson. Greed, perhaps? Or maybe something even darker, something deeper than wealth. The opal is a rare thing, not simply valuable in a material sense, but in what it represents. I believe it was never just a jewel. It's a symbol of influence, of something much larger than a mere transaction." Captain Blackwood, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "If you're suggesting that Lord Wentworth is involved in subversive activities, then what about the courier, that Captain Harrison? He claims to have been drugged and robbed. Why would Wentworth not have protected the gem more carefully if he knew it was of such importance?" Holmes slowed his pace, considering the question. He looked at Blackwood thoughtfully before responding, his voice low. "There are many layers to this mystery, Captain. Lord Wentworth may not have been the mastermind. Perhaps he was simply a player in a larger scheme. The opal might have been stolen as part of a plan to fund rebellion, but it may not have been part of Wentworth's design. No, he's too clever for that. I suspect he is shielding someone or something far more dangerous." Watson, eager to pursue the trail of thought, interjected. "And the tavern, the one you mentioned earlier, Holmes, the place you think Lefebvre may be involved with." Holmes gave a small nod, his eyes narrowing as he looked towards the east end of the city. "The East End, Watson, a place of shadows and secrets. It's where men like Lefebvre, men with dubious associations, tend to dwell. There is a tavern called the Black Feather, known for being a gathering place for certain individuals with less than lawful occupations. If Lefebvre is as involved in the unrest as I suspect, then it's likely his dealings can be traced to such places. We must go there next." Blackwood seemed uneasy at the thought. "The East End is hardly a safe place for gentlemen like ourselves. It's a den of thieves and cutthroats." Holmes glanced over his shoulder, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Indeed, Captain, but sometimes the path to truth is fraught with danger. And, as you've no doubt gathered, we are not merely seeking answers for the theft of a jewel. This is far more complicated than that." The journey to the East End was fraught with unease. The carriage they rode in lurched along the rough roads, and the deeper they moved into the area, the more the grime of the city seemed to thicken. The buildings were taller here, their windows grimy and shuttered, and the air was thick with the smells of coal smoke sewage and the faint, sour tang of fish from the nearby docks. As they neared their destination, the streets became narrower, the crowds thicker. People bustled past with hurried steps, their faces gaunt and lined with exhaustion, their eyes avoiding the gaze of strangers. Here, in the shadow of the city's poorest district, the scent of decay was almost palpable. The tavern, the Black Feather, was nestled between two dilapidated buildings. Its sign, a painted black feather on a chipped wooden board, hung crookedly above the door. The building was unremarkable at first glance, except for the faint glow spilling from the windows, which Holmes observed was strangely inconsistent. The light seemed to flicker, as though it were struggling to stay alight in the oppressive darkness of the street. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance before entering. The moment they crossed the threshold, the heat and noise of the tavern hit them. It was a dingy, smoke-filled room, its low ceiling sagging with age. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat, alcohol, and something else, something faintly metallic. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the dim light of a few poorly maintained lanterns barely illuminated the room. The patrons here were a rough crowd, men with calloused hands, faces hardened by years of hard labor, and eyes that darted suspiciously at any newcomer. Holmes led the way, his sharp gaze taking in every detail, his mind already sorting through the possibilities. Watson, somewhat out of place in the grim surroundings, kept his hand near his coat pocket where his revolver rested, ready for any trouble. At the bar, a grizzled barkeep, his graying beard matted with bits of tobacco, glanced up as they approached. He didn't seem surprised to see them, as though he had expected visitors of their sort. "What can I get you, gents?" The barkeep rasped, his voice low, almost a whisper. "We're looking for a man named Georges Lefebvre," Holmes said, his voice steady but carrying a note of command. "Perhaps you've heard of him." The barkeep's expression flickered for a brief moment, just a slight widening of his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a grunt. "Lefebvre, eh? Can't say I know him. Not by that name." Holmes leaned in, his gaze sharp. "I think you do, and I think you'll tell me where I can find him. Now, don't make me ask again." The room seemed to hush, the patrons pausing mid-conversation to glance at the intruders. The barkeep hesitated, his fingers twitching toward a bottle of gin, but before he could speak, a voice interrupted from the far corner of the tavern. "Leave him be, George. These men aren't from around here." The voice was low, smooth, and unmistakable. Holmes turned toward it instantly, his eyes narrowing as he saw the man lounging in the far corner of the room, a tall, lean figure dressed in a dark suit that stood out like a shadow against the backdrop of the squalid tavern. His face was pale, almost sickly, with sharp features and dark, penetrating eyes that glimmered with a dangerous intelligence. Georges Lefebvre. Holmes straightened, a glint of recognition in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd join us," he said, his tone cool, unfazed by the sudden tension in the room. "Now we can talk freely, Lefebvre. No need for secrets anymore." Lefebvre smiled, though there was little warmth in the expression. "Secrets? My dear Holmes, I assure you, the only thing secret in this place is how long you'll last if you don't mind your manners." Chapter 4. The Web of Deceit. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, Holmes and Lefebvre locked eyes, two predators sizing each other up in a dimly lit den of secrets. The murmurs of the tavern patrons fell into a strained silence as the two men exchanged unspoken words. Watson, sensing the delicate balance of power in the room, stood close to Holmes, his hand still near his coat pocket, though he had no intention of drawing his revolver. Not yet, at least. Lefebvre's smile never quite reached his eyes, which gleamed with a sharpness that betrayed a deep well of cunning. He took a languid sip from a glass of amber liquid, eyeing Holmes as he set the glass down with a deliberate slowness. "Well, Holmes," Lefebvre said, his voice smooth and deliberate, "you've found me. I'm flattered, but what makes you think I would be willing to talk to you, let alone in a place like this?" Holmes did not flinch. He stepped forward, his coat billowing slightly, and leaned against the bar with an air of quiet authority. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and calm. "You underestimate the power of curiosity, Lefebvre, and perhaps you underestimate the weight of the situation you find yourself in. You're involved in something far more dangerous than you likely realize, something that could unravel your carefully constructed life here in the shadows of London." Lefebvre's lips curled into a wry smile. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm involved in, Holmes. But do you? You see, you're chasing a ghost, a precious stone, a trinket, if you will. And in doing so, you've stumbled into something far deeper than you can comprehend. The opal is not merely a jewel. It's a symbol. A very dangerous symbol." Holmes narrowed his eyes, the gears of his mind spinning faster. He had expected arrogance from Lefebvre, but what he heard now was something different, something far more sinister. The opal, which had seemed a simple item of theft at first, was suddenly woven into a tapestry of something far darker. "A symbol of what exactly?" Holmes asked, his voice taut with intrigue. Lefebvre laughed softly, the sound almost a hiss. "You are clever, Holmes. I'll give you that. But cleverness alone won't save you. Not when you're playing with forces that have no interest in fair play." "Then perhaps you should enlighten me, Mr. Lefebvre," Holmes said, his voice unwavering. "I assure you I am quite capable of handling such forces." Lefebvre leaned back in his chair, his posture languid but his gaze never leaving Holmes. You know of the unrest in India, don't you? The whispers of rebellion, of the colonial unrest that has been simmering for years. You know that there are factions in this very city who wish to fan those flames, who wish to see the British Empire crumble. Holmes's eyes sharpened at the mention of India. He had suspected as much, but hearing Lefebvre speak it so openly was something else entirely. The opal, then, was more than just a gem. It was a piece in a far larger game. The opal, Lefebvre continued, his voice lowering, was never meant to be stolen. It was meant to be sent as a message to certain people in the colonies who would use its worth to fund an insurrection that, if successful, would shift the balance of power. But as with all things, things don't always go according to plan. The gem was lost in transit, and now we're here. Watson, ever the skeptic, furrowed his brow. Are you suggesting that the theft of the opal is part of some larger conspiracy to incite rebellion in India? He asked, his voice lathe disbelief. Lefebvre glanced at Watson as though he were an annoying fly buzzing near his ear. Of course, Dr. Watson. You think the unrest is simply about poverty and oppression? It's far more organized than that. The men who back these rebellions, men with power, wealth, and influence, are not interested in a simple uprising. They want to see a revolution. And the opal is merely one piece in the puzzle, a tool, a symbol, and, unfortunately for you, an object of great importance. Holmes's mind raced. A conspiracy to finance rebellion in the colonies, a rebellion that had been quietly gaining momentum. It all made sense now in a twisted sort of way. The gem wasn't just valuable for its rarity, it was valuable for what it represented, a catalyst, a symbol to rally support and fund an insurrection. Tell me, Lefebvre, Holmes asked, his voice quiet but intense, how does Lord Wentworth fit into this? Does he know what he's been involved in? Lefebvre's lips curled into a smile, but it was thin and cold. Wentworth? He echoed, as though the name were a trivial thing. He's a pawn, just like you, Holmes. A man with a fancy title and an inflated sense of importance. He has no idea what he's been dragged into. Or perhaps he does, and he simply doesn't care. Either way, it doesn't matter. He's not the one who's running the show. Holmes's thoughts momentarily flickered to the meeting with Lord Wentworth earlier that day. The nobleman had been evasive, even defensive, when questioned about the gem's importance. He had, as Holmes had suspected, been hiding something, though whether that something was a direct connection to this rebellion or merely a set of tangled financial interests remained to be seen. "And the courier, Captain Harrison," Watson said, his voice steady. "What about him? Was he part of this plot?" Lefebvre's eyes gleamed, and for the first time he seemed to show genuine interest in the question. Harrison? Now that is a curious case. I'm inclined to believe he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps he was drugged, as he claims. But Harrison is not the one you should be worrying about. The real danger lies elsewhere. Closer to you than you think. Holmes's pulse quickened. Where? He asked, his voice low. Lefebvre's smile widened, his gaze narrowing into a predatory focus. In your own investigation, Holmes. The more you dig, the more you uncover, the closer you get to the heart of this web. But be careful. There are eyes everywhere. The men you think are your allies? They might just be the ones who've been pulling the strings all along. Holmes did not flinch. His mind was already calculating the next steps, turning over the possibilities like a well-worn chessboard. Lefebvre's words, however cryptic, held a weight of truth. The web of deceit was far larger than he had anticipated, and the opal was only a small thread that led to a much greater conspiracy. "Thank you for your hospitality, Lefebvre," Holmes said coolly. "You've been most informative." Lefebvre inclined his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Holmes's face. "The pleasure was mine, Holmes. I do hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in the East End." With a swift motion, Holmes turned on his heel, signaling Watson to follow. As they made their way toward the door, the tavern seemed to close in on them, the eyes of the patrons like shadows, watching every movement. The fog outside had thickened even further, and the distant sound of the carriage wheels on the cobbled street felt muted, swallowed by the weight of the mystery that was quickly spiraling out of control. The game was afoot, but it was a game with stakes higher than either Holmes or Watson could have anticipated. And the deeper they ventured into the shadowy corridors of London's underworld, the more dangerous it became. Chapter 5. The web tightens. The fog hung thick in the streets like a shroud, muting the sounds of London and making every step feel both distant and urgent. Holmes and Watson left the seedy tavern behind, their minds abuzz with the gravity of Lefebvre's cryptic words. The East End had always been a place of mystery and danger, but now, with the mention of rebellion, hidden conspiracies, and shadows that reached all the way from the colonies to the heart of the British Empire, the city itself felt like a labyrinth of deceit. As the two men walked briskly through the fog, Holmes remained deep in thought, his eyes flickering with sharp intensity as he processed the revelations from Lefebvre. Watson, ever observant, could see the familiar gleam in his friend's eyes, the one that indicated a solution was near, but still elusive. The doctor kept pace, though his mind wandered to the more immediate implications of their findings. Holmes, do you truly believe that Captain Harrison was just an innocent bystander? Watson asked, breaking the silence. You mentioned you were skeptical of his story from the beginning, but Lefebvre's claim that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time seems a bit too convenient. Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly, the edge of his brow furrowing. There's no such thing as coincidence in this line of work, Watson. Harrison's story may have been manufactured, but it fits neatly into a larger narrative. Whether he was complicit or simply a pawn, I cannot say for certain yet, but I am inclined to believe that he's a part of something far greater, a piece of a puzzle that we've yet to fully see. And the opal? Watson continued, his voice tinged with curiosity. If it's as valuable as Lefebvre suggests, and it's tied to a colonial rebellion, what makes it so special? Surely there are more valuable jewels to be had in the world. Holmes paused momentarily, allowing the question to settle. The opal is not valuable simply for its intrinsic worth, Watson. It's the symbol that it carries, the hope it represents for those who seek to destabilize the empire. You see, in times of unrest, symbols are far more potent than the material itself. A rare gem, an untraceable artifact, can rally support, can inspire passion, and perhaps more importantly, can finance a war. The Opal of Wight is a rallying point. It is as much a currency of rebellion as it is a jewel. Watson nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Holmes' words. The journey ahead would no doubt be treacherous. The two men arrived back at Baker Street in near silence, the dull thrum of the city around them failing to pierce Holmes' focus. As they entered, Holmes wasted no time in placing his coat over the chair and lighting a small lamp. He turned to Watson, his voice low but certain. We must pay a visit to the jeweler Herrick. There's something about his connection to the opal that doesn't sit right with me. If he is the man who was meant to handle the gem's delivery, we need to ascertain exactly what role he played and how he fits into this web of intrigue. Watson raised an eyebrow. I thought we were still investigating Lefebvre. I can't help but wonder if he's merely a middleman, Holmes. Shouldn't we be following the leads we already have? Holmes smiled, his lips curling with the satisfaction of a mind always moving ahead. Ah, but Watson, the closer we get to Lefebvre, the more we risk being misled. He's a clever man, but even clever men leave traces. The jeweler, Herrick, is a man of connections, and those connections are far more interesting than we first believed. He must know more about the opal's intended path, perhaps even more than he lets on. And the more we understand his involvement, the better we can anticipate our next moves. Without further hesitation, Holmes grabbed his hat and coat, signaling to Watson that the next leg of their investigation had begun. The streets of London seemed even murkier under the cover of night, the gaslights casting long, flickering shadows. Holmes and Watson made their way to the prestigious jewelry store of Herrick & Co., a place that catered to London's elite. The storefront glistened with the polished sheen of expensive gems and meticulously arranged displays, but Holmes knew well that appearances often masked darker truths. As they entered, the bell above the door chimed softly, signaling their arrival. A young woman, dressed in a fine gown, emerged from the back, her face one of practiced politeness. Her eyes, however, seemed to flicker with something darker when they fell upon Holmes and Watson. "How may I assist you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice laced with just the right amount of professionalism, and though her eyes never fully met theirs. "We are here to speak with Mr. Herrick," Holmes said, his tone cool and direct. It is regarding a recent transaction of a rare opal, one known as the Opal of Wight. At the mention of the opal, the young woman's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, and her posture stiffened. Holmes noted the change, a subtle shift that confirmed his suspicions. Herrick & Co. was more involved in the opal's mystery than they had initially realized. "Mr. Herrick is not in at the moment," she said quickly, but Holmes could detect the slight falter in her voice. "Perhaps I can be of assistance?" Holmes took a step forward, his gaze steady but probing. "I'm afraid this matter cannot wait. It pertains to a very urgent investigation, and I'm sure Mr. Herrick will understand the need for his immediate cooperation." The woman hesitated, but only for a moment. With a quiet nod, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the back of the shop, leaving Holmes and Watson standing in the gleaming silence of the showroom. Watson glanced around, his eyes scanning the walls filled with gemstones and intricate jewelry. "What do you think, Holmes? Do you believe Herrick is involved with the conspiracy?" Holmes didn't answer right away. His attention focused on the shifting patterns of light on the gems before him. "I believe Herrick is more than just a jeweler, Watson. The opal didn't end up in his hands by accident. Someone orchestrated its transfer to him, and whether or not he is complicit in the theft remains to be seen. But there's something else, something far more calculated. If Herrick is truly unaware of the deeper game, I'll eat my hat." Watson gave Holmes a look, but before he could respond, the young woman returned with Herrick in tow. The jeweler was a tall man in his mid-40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He looked every bit the part of a man who catered to the upper crust of society, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that betrayed a deeper, more calculating mind. "Mr. Herrick," Holmes began, "I hope I haven't caused you too much inconvenience, but I require your assistance regarding a matter of great importance." Herrick raised an eyebrow, his demeanor cool and composed. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes. I run a reputable establishment, and I'm sure any transactions involving precious jewels are above reproach." Holmes didn't flinch at Herrick's attempt at evasion. "Of course, Mr. Herrick, but we know that the Opal of Wight passed through your hands recently. What you might not know is that this particular gem is tied to a larger scheme, one that could have profound consequences for both you and your business." The jeweler's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're insinuating, Mr. Holmes. I handle many transactions, but I assure you I have no knowledge of any scheme, as you call it." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "I think you know more than you let on, Herrick. It's not about the opal anymore. It's about the lives that are at stake." The tension between them was palpable, the silence in the room growing heavy as both men stared each other down. Watson's hand instinctively moved toward his coat pocket, his senses alert to the palpable danger. But before anyone could speak again, a sharp knock echoed from the back office. Holmes turned sharply toward the door, his mind already racing ahead. Someone else had arrived, and it was clear they were about to learn something that could change the course of the investigation forever. Chapter 6. Secrets Behind the Velvet Curtain. The door to the back office swung open with a creak, and a tall figure stepped into the dim light of the jewelry showroom. Holmes, his mind already racing ahead, could not help but notice the man's posture, a military bearing that immediately suggested discipline and authority. His sharp, almost predatory gaze swept over the room before settling on Holmes and Watson with a mixture of cool recognition and palpable disdain. "Ah, Herrick," the man said with a voice smooth as velvet, yet edged with something darker, something calculated. "I see you found some uninvited guests." Holmes didn't flinch. Instead, his eyes flickered briefly over the man before returning to Herrick. The situation was about to change, and he needed to grasp every clue within his reach. "This is Mr. Langley," Herrick said, his voice betraying a slight unease. "He's a business associate of mine." "Is that so?" Holmes replied, his gaze unflinching as he studied the newcomer with silent scrutiny. He could already tell that Langley was no ordinary businessman. He had the presence of a man who had been involved in much more than simple trade. The faint gleam in his eyes was enough to signal that he had something to hide. Langley regarded Holmes for a moment, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. I understand you're investigating the opal. The Opal of Wight, was it? A rare and highly prized possession, certainly not one that just ends up in the wrong hands without significant effort. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes locking with Langley's, undeterred by the man's arrogance. I believe you're right. And as it happens, Mr. Langley, I'm here to make sure that no one gets away with any significant effort at the expense of the law. You see, the opal you're so keen to discuss has gone missing, and I intend to find out exactly how it disappeared. Watson shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the air. Langley's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, a shadow passing over his features. It was enough for Holmes to see that Langley knew more than he let on. I'm sure you're familiar with the chain of ownership of this particular jewel, Herrick, Holmes continued, his tone deliberate. And yet, you've been evasive when asked about it. Now, it seems Mr. Langley here is equally reticent. Perhaps we should clear the air, gentlemen, before matters spiral any further. Herrick's face paled, and for a moment Holmes wondered if he might crack under the pressure. But it was Langley who spoke next, his voice smooth and mocking, though the sharpness of his words could not hide the undercurrent of alarm. Perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you should ask your questions more carefully. I'm sure Herrick is more than happy to answer anything that concerns his business. As for the opal... Langley paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Holmes tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching as he gauged the man's every word. On the contrary, Mr. Langley, I believe I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and I suspect you do too. This isn't just about a rare gemstone. It's about something much more dangerous, something that, if left unchecked, could cause a great deal of harm. Langley chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're playing a dangerous game, Holmes, but I suppose that's what makes you... interesting. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. I would advise you to reconsider your approach before you involve yourself in matters beyond your comprehension. The words hung in the air, the room growing colder as the unspoken threat settled between them. But before Holmes could respond, Watson, ever the pragmatist, cleared his throat loudly, drawing Langley's attention away. Excuse me, Mr. Langley, Watson said, his voice firm. While I understand that there are, no doubt, important matters at hand, we are not here to be intimidated. We are here to get to the truth. And if you or Herrick have any knowledge of the whereabouts of the opal, I would suggest you disclose it before this investigation reaches a point where neither of you can turn back. Langley's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he regained his composure. You have your work cut out for you, Doctor, but I do admire your persistence. Holmes took a step closer, his voice quiet but with a chilling edge. We are well past the point of mere persistence, Mr. Langley. We've moved into the realm of consequences. The tension in the room thickened, the air almost crackling with an electric charge. Herrick shifted nervously behind his counter, while Langley seemed to weigh his options carefully. Finally, he straightened, his eyes locking with Holmes once more, and then with a casual flick of his wrist, he spoke. The Opal of Wight is not just a jewel. It's a key, a symbol of something far greater than any of you realize. Langley's tone was suddenly devoid of mockery, his voice low and dangerous. But be warned, Mr. Holmes, there are powers at play here that extend far beyond the walls of this shop. I suggest you tread carefully. Holmes' eyes gleamed, his mind already turning over the implications of Langley's words. A symbol of something greater. What did he mean by that? And how did it all tie back to the colonial rebellion, the conspiracy, and the missing opal? Before he could pursue the line of questioning further, Langley turned, his movements deliberate and smooth. I think this conversation is over for now. You will find no answers here, gentlemen. His gaze flickered to Herrick, who seemed almost relieved by Langley's intervention. Take your inquiries elsewhere. But remember this, Mr. Holmes, the game you are playing is not one you can win. With that, Langley turned and strode out of the shop, his footsteps echoing through the silence that remained in his wake. Holmes watched him go, his expression unreadable. Watson looked at his friend, sensing the mounting tension. What now, Holmes? Watson asked quietly. He's thrown down the gauntlet, and I suspect we have no choice but to follow it. Holmes paused, deep in thought, before turning back to Herrick. You have been very evasive, Mr. Herrick. I believe we need to take a closer look at your dealings. You have more knowledge of this than you've let on. Herrick's mouth tightened, but before he could respond, Holmes added, I suggest you come clean, Herrick. The longer you withhold the truth, the more danger you put yourself in. The jeweler swallowed, his hands trembling ever so slightly. What do you want to know, Mr. Holmes? Holmes' eyes flicked to Watson, and the two shared a brief look of understanding. The game had changed, and now the pieces were starting to fall into place. The opal's provenance, Holmes said sharply. Where did it come from, and why did it end up in your hands? Who else is involved in this? Herrick hesitated, and Holmes could see the man was on the verge of a decision. Whether he would cooperate or fall silent was yet to be seen. But one thing was clear. Holmes was closing in on something much larger than the theft of a single jewel. And as the night deepened, it became evident that the answers they sought lay far beyond the walls of Herrick's shop. The real mystery, it seemed, was only just beginning. Holmes remained motionless, his piercing gaze fixed firmly on Herrick. The jeweler's unease grew more apparent as the silence stretched, the air thick with anticipation. Watson watched the exchange intently, knowing full well that Holmes was preparing to strike at just the right moment. Finally, Herrick's voice broke the stillness, though it was scarcely more than a whisper. I know nothing of the opal's history before it came into my hands. It arrived from an anonymous source, as many rare and valuable pieces do. I was instructed to keep it under lock and key until further notice. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Anonymous? I find that rather convenient. And who was the instructing party, Mr. Herrick? If you cannot give me a name, at least tell me what you were promised for your involvement in this transaction. Herrick shifted uncomfortably, his hands moving to adjust the cuffs of his sleeves as though the gesture would provide some semblance of control over the situation. I was paid handsomely for the opal's safe transport and storage, Mr. Holmes. That is all. There was no promise of anything more. Safe transport and storage? Holmes's voice was sharp with disbelief. And yet you allowed the opal to be stolen from under your very nose? Herrick's face reddened slightly, and then lifted his pride wounded. It was not stolen from here. The courier, Captain Craddock, was entrusted with the opal, and it was during his journey from the port that the incident occurred. He claims he was drugged and robbed. I know nothing more of it. And yet, Mr. Herrick, Holmes said slowly, his voice almost conversational, the opal was not lost in transit to you, was it? It was stolen from Captain Craddock before it ever arrived at your door. Herrick's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. How do you know that? Holmes leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. The courier's story doesn't add up, and more importantly, he knew of the opal's value long before it was entrusted to him. A man who claims to have been drugged and robbed would hardly know what he was carrying, let alone understand its worth. The opal's disappearance is not a simple case of theft. It is part of a much larger plot. The jeweler swallowed visibly, his face pale. You are suggesting that Captain Craddock was involved in the theft? Holmes nodded slightly. I believe the captain is only one part of a much more intricate web. The opal was never truly lost, Mr. Herrick. It was stolen to finance something far more dangerous. Dangerous? Herrick echoed, his voice trembling with the weight of the word. What do you mean? Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing in thought as he gathered his next words carefully. The opal was never meant to be a simple jewel. It is a symbol, a tool used by those with more sinister ambitions. And from what I have learned, it is tied to a movement in the colonies, one that threatens the stability of the empire. Watson stepped forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. But why would someone go to such lengths to use a gem for such a purpose? Holmes turned to his companion, his voice a quiet murmur. A symbol can carry immense power, Watson. If the opal is connected to a rebellion, then it may be used as a rallying point for insurgents. But it is more than that. It's a piece of something much larger, perhaps a way to fund the cause, to gather support. Herrick, though clearly shaken by the direction of the conversation, was not yet ready to admit defeat. You've no proof of such a claim, Mr. Holmes, he said, his tone more defensive than before. This is all speculation. Holmes' gaze sharpened as he stood straighter, the air around him suddenly crackling with the intensity of his focus. Speculation, yes, but based on evidence. Evidence that I have yet to fully uncover. Tell me, Mr. Herrick, do you know anything of a tavern in the East End? A place called the Velvet Curtain? Herrick's reaction was immediate. His face paled further, and for a split second, Holmes could see a flicker of recognition in the jeweler's eyes before he quickly masked it. The Velvet Curtain? Herrick stammered. I know of it, but it is hardly the sort of place you'd visit, Mr. Holmes. Oh, but I think it is the sort of place I must visit, Holmes replied coolly. You see, I have reason to believe that it is there that the stolen opal will be sold, and it is there that I will find the key to unlocking the rest of this conspiracy. Herrick seemed to wilt under Holmes' gaze, his bravado slipping away entirely. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes, he muttered, his voice no longer carrying the confident ring it once had. The Velvet Curtain is a den of iniquity, a place for gamblers, thieves, and those with less than legal interests. I have no dealings with it. Holmes's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. I'm sure, but you must also know that people like you, men with your level of involvement in such transactions, do not simply ignore places like that. You visit them when it suits you. Enough, Herrick spat, his voice sharp with a newfound edge of desperation. I've told you what I know. If you think you can solve this, go ahead. But I warn you, Holmes, there are people you do not want to cross. Not in this matter. Holmes did not flinch at Herrick's threat. Instead, his eyes gleamed with quiet determination. You are underestimating me, Mr. Herrick. The game is afoot, and I intend to see it through. You may have only seen a small piece of this puzzle, but I assure you, I will uncover the whole picture. Watson stepped forward, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. Let's go, Holmes. We have enough to work with for now, but I'm not sure we'll find much else here. Holmes nodded absently, his mind already spinning with possibilities. As they turned to leave the shop, the door to the back office clicked open behind them, and for just a moment, Holmes caught a glimpse of Langley's shadow in the doorway. It was clear that the game was far from over. The stolen opal was no longer just a rare gem. It was the heart of a conspiracy, and now Holmes had to follow the threads wherever they led, no matter how deep or dangerous the path became. Chapter 7. The Velvet Curtain. The evening air was damp, a persistent mist curling its way through the narrow streets of London's East End. The gas lamps flickered in the gloom, casting long shadows on the cobbled paths as Holmes and Watson walked in silence, the weight of the mystery pressing down on them. Holmes, as usual, was deep in thought, his pace purposeful, each step calculated. Watson, though equally intrigued by the case, found himself reflecting on the strange turn their investigation had taken. The opal, a gem of unspeakable value, had already proved to be far more than a simple piece of jewelry. It had become a symbol, one that threatened to ignite rebellion and upheaval, and now it was tied to the most sordid parts of London's underbelly. The Velvet Curtain, Watson. Holmes finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. A place like no other in the city, I imagine. There are few taverns in London that can claim such a name, one that suggests opulence and decadence, a velvet luxury that hides darker truths. Watson raised an eyebrow, glancing at his companion. You think it's a front for something more? Sinister? Holmes's lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. I believe it is more than just a place to drink and gamble. The name alone suggests something far more theatrical, more dangerous. It may be a hub for dealings that go beyond mere financial transactions. They approached a narrow alleyway, dimly lit by the flickering lamplight. At the end of the alley was a door, ornate, but worn with age, its brass handle polished by the many hands that had passed through. A faint sound of music and muffled voices echoed from inside, a low hum of conversation mixed with the occasional burst of laughter. Holmes stopped just short of the door and turned to Watson. This is it, Watson? Our destination, the Velvet Curtain. Watson's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. It hardly looks like the type of place to host a rebellion. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Appearances can be deceiving. The wealth that flows through such establishments often hides an undercurrent of discontent. The most dangerous plans are often made in places like this, under the guise of merrymaking. With a swift motion, Holmes grasped the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into the tavern. The air inside was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and the scent of sweat, as though the room itself had absorbed years of debauchery. The low murmur of conversation swirled around them, and a few heads turned as they entered, but for the most part, the patrons paid them no mind. The tavern was dimly lit, the furniture mismatched, wooden tables and chairs clustered haphazardly together in every available space. The walls were draped with heavy velvet curtains, their deep red fabric rich and imposing, giving the room a sense of oppressive luxury. The atmosphere was heavy, suffused with a quiet tension, as if every conversation held secrets just beneath the surface. Holmes scanned the room quickly, his eyes flicking over the various patrons. A few men sat hunched over drinks, speaking in hushed tones, while others played cards or dice in the corners. Near the back, a small stage was lit by a solitary spotlight, where a singer crooned a melancholy tune, the haunting melody barely audible above the noise of the tavern. "It's exactly as I imagined," Holmes murmured. "A place where men meet in the shadows, their dealings hidden behind the curtain of a false veneer." Watson was more concerned with the immediate surroundings, his eyes darting to the patrons who watched them with mild curiosity. "We shouldn't linger too long, Holmes. We're hardly inconspicuous in this place." Holmes gave a slight nod, his sharp gaze already picking out a figure across the room. There, the man in the dark coat, sitting alone at that table. "I believe he's expecting us." Watson followed his friend's line of sight and saw a man who fit the description, a tall, lean figure with a sharp nose and dark hair, sitting with his back to the wall, as if to guard his position. He wore a black coat, its high collar turned up, and his fingers lightly tapped on the rim of his glass. His eyes, however, were fixed on them, and he gave a barely perceptible nod when Holmes met his gaze. "Shall we?" Holmes asked, his voice a mere whisper. With a reluctant sigh, Watson nodded. "Lead the way, Holmes." The two made their way across the room, Holmes's movements smooth and purposeful. As they approached the table, the man stood up, offering a polite but cold smile. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the man said, his voice low and measured. "I trust the journey has not been too taxing." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "We've had better days, Mr. Rayner, but I'm glad to find you exactly where we expected." The man, Rayner, gave a small laugh, his eyes glinting with a touch of amusement. "I have my reasons for being in such places. The velvet curtain offers a certain anonymity. One can conduct business here without attracting too much attention." "Business?" Watson echoed, his tone skeptical. "And what business would someone like you conduct here, Mr. Rayner?" Rayner's lips curled into a faint smirk. "I deal in information, Dr. Watson. Information that's worth far more than a simple coin." Holmes took a seat without waiting for an invitation, his eyes never leaving Rayner. "I've heard you're connected to certain parties with interests in colonial affairs, specifically the rebellion brewing in India. Tell me, Mr. Rayner, do you also deal in stolen jewels?" Rayner's expression didn't falter, but Holmes saw a flicker of tension in the way his fingers tightened around his glass. "Stolen jewels?" Rayner repeated, his voice cold. "I'm afraid you have me mistaken, Mr. Holmes. I deal only in the trade of information. Nothing so crude as theft." "Nothing so crude," Holmes mused, leaning back in his chair. "And yet the Opal of Wight has found its way into the hands of people like you, Mr. Rayner. I wonder, then, what its true purpose is. You see, I believe it is more than just a jewel. I believe it's a key to something much bigger, something that involves far more than mere commerce." Rayner's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his composure. "You overestimate your position, Mr. Holmes. I have no intention of discussing matters of business with you, especially not in such a public setting." Holmes didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to play games, Mr. Rayner. I came here for answers, and I will find them, one way or another." Rayner stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I think you've overstayed your welcome, Mr. Holmes. You and your companion should leave." Holmes remained seated, his gaze unwavering. "Perhaps you're right, but I'll be back, Mr. Rayner, and next time I'll be ready." Rayner's lips curled into a thin smile. "Do try, Mr. Holmes, but be warned, the truth you seek is more dangerous than you can imagine." Holmes nodded, his eyes hardening. "We'll see about that." As the two men turned to leave, Holmes caught a glimpse of the man in the corner, a shadowy figure, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that fleeting glance, Holmes saw something more than a mere stranger. He saw a player in a game far larger than either of them fully understood. As they stepped back into the cold night air, Watson spoke first. "Holmes, what now?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with determination. "Now, Watson, we prepare for the next move. Rayner is a piece in this puzzle, but he's far from the one holding all the cards." The chill of the evening air clung to their coats as Holmes and Watson made their way back through the winding streets of the East End, the flickering gas lamps casting long, warped shadows on the cobbles. The peculiar atmosphere of the velvet curtain still lingered, the tension in the air almost palpable, as if something dark and heavy pressed against them, watching from the corners of the room. Holmes, his brow furrowed, moved with purpose, but Watson could not shake the unease that had settled in his gut. The velvet curtain had been unlike any tavern he had ever encountered. There was something otherworldly about it, as though it was a place where truths were hidden beneath a veneer of opulence and indulgence. "The man we spoke with?" "Rayner," Watson said, breaking the silence. "He knew something, Holmes. I could see it in his eyes, but he's playing his cards close to his chest." Holmes's lips twisted into a faint smile, a knowing look flashing in his eyes. "Of course he knows something, Watson, and that's precisely why I believe he has a connection to this web of deceit we've uncovered. He's not the mastermind, but he's certainly involved." Watson shook his head, his brow furrowing as they turned onto a broader street. "But what does he have to do with a stolen gem, or the rebellion in India? Why would a man like him be involved in such affairs?" Holmes walked on, his pace unaltered. "That, my dear Watson, is exactly what we must find out. Rayner may not be the architect, but he is a crucial part of this conspiracy. He's not a mere merchant of information. No, Watson, he is someone who stands at the edge of something far larger, an operation that may span continents." The two continued their walk, each lost in thought. They passed the occasional figure, their faces indistinct in the fog, but no one paid them much heed. The streets, though still busy, were quiet with the weight of the city's mysteries hanging heavy in the air. "Holmes," Watson began again, "where does all this lead? What's the endgame? A stolen opal? Rebellion? I fail to see how it all connects." Holmes stopped abruptly, his gaze scanning the surrounding buildings as though searching for something beyond their visible facades. He took a deep breath, the fog curling around him like a veil. "The key, Watson, lies not in the opal itself, but in what it represents. The Opal of Wight is no mere gem. It is a symbol, a tool to finance something much more dangerous than simple rebellion. Rayner's involvement is just the surface. Whoever stands behind him has far grander aspirations." Watson looked at Holmes, his mind struggling to catch up with the logic that flowed so effortlessly from his friend. "A symbol of what, then?" Holmes resumed walking, his pace once again steady, but now more deliberate, as though his mind was racing ahead of his physical body. "A rebellion, yes, but not just against the British Empire. No, Watson, this is a war for control. Control over resources, over the East India Company, over the very fabric of the colonies. The opal is part of a larger plan to finance arms, to incite insurrection in the colonies, and to shift the balance of power in favor of those who think they can topple empires." Watson was silent for a long moment, the weight of his friend's words settling in. It seemed almost too grand a scheme to be real, yet everything Holmes had said so far had led to this conclusion. "Do you think it's possible?" Watson finally asked. "That such a scheme could be in the works? With the opal being used as the catalyst?" Holmes stopped again, turning to face Watson, his eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. "The opal is the first piece, Watson. Whoever controls the opal controls the funds. And with funds, they can buy armies, bribe officials, and sway the public. But what they need is a person of influence, someone who has access to the highest levels of British society and a hand in the dealings of the East India Company." Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper, as though the very utterance of the words carried the weight of revelation. "And that, Watson, is why we must look to the jewelers, those who deal in rare and exotic gems. They are the ones who facilitate these exchanges. They are the ones who handle the wealth, and they are the ones who may have ties to the darker side of commerce." Watson's heart skipped a beat. He understood now. You think the jeweler, the one who was supposed to receive the opal, is part of this conspiracy? Holmes nodded, his gaze distant. I do. I think he's more than just a jeweler. I think he's a front for something far greater. And if we are to uncover the full extent of this plot, we must go to him. We must confront him directly. The two men walked in silence for a time, the fog now seeming to thicken around them, as if the city itself was hiding secrets within its folds. Holmes' mind was already spinning, planning his next move, but Watson was troubled. There was something about the way Holmes had spoken that suggested they were nearing a precipice. The next step they took could be the most dangerous of all. As they turned a corner and approached their destination, a nondescript townhouse where they believed the jeweler's office was located, Holmes glanced sideways at Watson. Stay alert, Watson. If I am correct, this man may not be as cooperative as our friend, Mr. Rayner. We must be prepared for anything. Watson nodded, a chill running through him. It wasn't just the mist in the air. There was a sense of impending danger, of the unknown waiting just beyond their reach. Holmes raised his hand to signal for Watson to stay back as they reached the door. He knocked sharply 3 times, his knuckles striking the wood with a steady, rhythmic sound. They waited for a moment, and then the door creaked open slowly. A man stood on the other side, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He looked older than Holmes had expected, his eyes narrow and calculating, his clothes pressed and immaculate. He gave them both a cursory glance before stepping aside to allow them entry. I was expecting you, he said, his voice low and smooth, but with an edge of tension beneath it. Holmes stepped into the room without hesitation. I trust you've been following the news, Mr. Cartwright. The jeweler, Cartwright, closed the door softly behind them and turned toward them, his expression unreadable. News? He asked, his tone deceptively neutral. The theft of the Opal of Wight? Holmes replied, his eyes locking with the jeweler's. I suspect you know more than you've let on. You've been involved in this, haven't you? In ways you would rather not admit. For a moment, Cartwright said nothing, his eyes flicking to the corner of the room as though seeking an escape. But when he turned back to face them, there was something more in his gaze, something darker. You've been asking the wrong questions, Mr. Holmes, Cartwright said, his voice lower now, with a menace that sent a ripple of unease through Watson's chest. But I suppose that's what makes you dangerous, isn't it? Always asking, always probing. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And you, Mr. Cartwright, are about to give me the answers. The tension in the room was now palpable, the game shifting toward its dangerous climax. Holmes was closing in on the truth, but at what cost? Chapter 8. The Silent Negotiation. The room was thick with tension as Holmes and Watson stood before Mr. Cartwright, the jeweler, who had yet to move from his spot in the middle of the dimly lit room. The walls, once gleaming with polished wood and marble, now appeared to press in on them with the weight of secrets. It was a fine parlor, furnished in the kind of opulence that might suggest a man with the wealth to shape the fate of empires. A man like Cartwright. Holmes, ever the unshaken figure of focus, did not flinch at the jeweler's calculated silence. Instead, he stared directly at him, his gaze sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. Watson, on the other hand, felt his unease grow, a tightening in his chest as though the walls themselves were beginning to close in. Well, Mr. Cartwright, Holmes began, his voice cool, yet laden with quiet authority. You know, of course, that I am not a man who engages in idle conversation. We both understand that the theft of the Opal of Wight was not merely an unfortunate event. There is much more at play here, and you, whether willingly or not, are involved. Cartwright's lips curled slightly, though his eyes betrayed no emotion. I'm sure you've painted an elaborate picture, Mr. Holmes, but I have nothing to offer you, I'm afraid. Holmes took a deliberate step forward, his presence commanding the room. Oh, I think you do, he said, his voice lowering slightly. The opal was being transported under your name, Mr. Cartwright. The East India Company trusted you with its safe passage, but it never arrived. Instead, a courier was found drugged and robbed. The opal was stolen under circumstances that point directly to your involvement. Watson, who had remained silent up to this point, looked to Cartwright for a response. He could not help but notice the slight tremor in the jeweler's fingers, the first visible sign of any vulnerability. Cartwright was a man who dealt in the unseen, in the market of gems and precious things. But this, the investigation into something much darker than stolen goods, was not something he seemed prepared for. "Your accusations are bold, Mr. Holmes," Cartwright replied evenly, though there was an edge to his words. "But you are mistaken. I am an honest merchant. The opal's theft was a misfortune, and beyond that, I have no further involvement." Holmes did not flinch. "You misunderstand me, Cartwright. I do not believe you are innocent. No, I believe you are far more than that." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I believe you are part of something far larger, a conspiracy that stretches across continents. The opal is not just a stolen treasure. It is the centerpiece of a covert operation designed to finance a rebellion, perhaps one that seeks to undo British influence in India, or worse, in the colonies at large." Cartwright's eyes flickered ever so slightly, but it was enough for Holmes to catch. A crack in the facade. "That's a very grand accusation," Cartwright said smoothly, but Holmes could detect the tremor of unease in his voice. "What evidence do you have to support such a claim?" "Evidence?" Holmes repeated, almost with a chuckle. "The evidence is all around you, Mr. Cartwright. It lies in the nature of your dealings. The question is, what was your role in these transactions? Who were you really working for?" Cartwright stepped back, his hands clasping behind his back. "You're fishing in murky waters, Mr. Holmes," he said with a careful, calculated air. "But I am not a fool. I know what you're after. I am no revolutionary, no rabble-rouser. I am a businessman. I deal in gems, not in matters of rebellion or insurrection." Holmes narrowed his eyes, his expression unreadable. "You say that, but your actions betray you. You handled the opal's transaction, and you've been linked to Rayner, who is connected to dubious enterprises. Your ties to him go beyond mere commerce, don't they?" Cartwright stiffened. For the first time, he seemed to lose his composure, his eyes darting briefly to the door, as if considering an escape. But before he could act, Holmes continued, his voice like steel. "I would advise you not to try and run, Mr. Cartwright. There is nowhere you can hide. Not now. The game is up." The jeweler's composure snapped back into place. He straightened, his gaze cold, calculating. "You may think you have all the answers, Mr. Holmes, but you are only scratching the surface. You have no idea what you're meddling with." Watson, who had been silently watching the exchange, finally stepped forward, his voice laced with suspicion. "Then perhaps you'll enlighten us, Cartwright. What's really going on here?" For a long moment, Cartwright said nothing. He simply stared at them with cold, unwavering eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy as a storm cloud. Then, as though some invisible barrier had been lifted, Cartwright spoke, but his words were carefully chosen, as though weighing each syllable with intent. "Listen well, Dr. Watson, and you too, Mr. Holmes. The opal is but a small part of a much larger picture. Yes, I know of Rayner. And yes, I know of the conspiracy, though not in the way you think. The opal is a means to an end, a symbol of something much greater, an effort to destabilize the British Empire's grip on India. But it's more than that. The rebellion is only the beginning." Holmes listened intently, his gaze fixed firmly on Cartwright as he spoke, each word adding more pieces to the puzzle. Watson, too, was rapt with attention, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation. "The opal," Cartwright continued, "was meant to be a symbol, a rallying cry for those who seek to disrupt the status quo. But it wasn't just about the gem. It was about what it represented. The opal's journey was meant to fund arms, to finance mercenaries, to support a movement that is already in motion." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who stands behind this movement, Mr. Cartwright? Who is orchestrating this rebellion?" Cartwright's lips twisted into a faint, bitter smile. "You're asking the wrong question, Holmes. It's not about who's behind it. It's about what they represent. The men behind this plot are not just rebels. They are revolutionaries, yes, but they also have far-reaching ambitions that extend beyond India, beyond the colonies. They seek to fracture the empire from within, to destroy the very structure that holds the world order in place." Watson felt a shiver run down his spine. "And you're helping them?" Cartwright's smile deepened, but there was no humor in it. "Not by choice, Doctor, but I am tied to this cause in ways you cannot understand. You, who have always stood for the law and order of the British Crown, cannot begin to fathom what it is like to live in a world where those in power seek only to exploit and oppress. But that is neither here nor there. What matters now is that you and your friend, Mr. Holmes, are far too involved, and you must be careful. Holmes stepped forward again, his presence looming over Cartwright like a predator eyeing its prey. Careful of what exactly? Cartwright leaned in, his eyes flickering with a dangerous intensity. Careful of who you trust. The web you're entangled in is far more complex than you realize. There are many hands at play, and you. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. You are playing a game that no one can win. Holmes took a sharp breath, his eyes glistening with understanding. So, you will not deny your involvement? Cartwright's eyes met Holmes's without flinching. I don't need to, he said softly. It's not a matter of denial. It's a matter of survival. Before either Holmes or Watson could react, the door to the parlor creaked open behind them. A figure stepped inside, tall and cloaked in shadow, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Cartwright's face paled, and the tension in the room escalated. Gentlemen, the figure said, his voice low and commanding. It seems you have been asking the wrong questions. Holmes' eyes gleamed with recognition. You, he muttered. Cartwright's face went ashen, and for the first time the jeweler seemed truly afraid. You shouldn't have come, Cartwright whispered. None of you should have come. The figure stepped further into the room, his silhouette now more defined by the flickering lamplight, revealing the sharp angles of his face and the cold, calculating glint in his eyes. The stranger was tall, wearing a dark coat that seemed to swallow the light, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his features, leaving his face in shadow. Holmes' sharp eyes darted over every detail, assessing the newcomer with practiced precision. Who are you? Holmes asked, his voice cool, yet with an undertone of command, as though the very question was an interrogation. The stranger did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted briefly to Cartwright, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. It was clear that Cartwright knew this man, or perhaps feared him more than he was willing to admit. Do you have the gall to show your face now? Cartwright spat, his voice trembling slightly. I told you, this is a mistake. Holmes is too clever for you to... Enough, Cartwright, the stranger interrupted, his voice smooth but laden with authority. This is no longer about your petty little scheme. This is about something much bigger. Holmes took a step closer, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the sudden shift in the conversation. This was no mere errant villain, no hapless conspirator. This man had a presence, an aura of command that was unmistakable. The way Cartwright recoiled at the sound of his voice was telling. This was a man who commanded fear, and fear was a powerful weapon. What is it that you're playing at? Holmes pressed, his gaze fixed intently on the stranger's face, still obscured by the shadow of his hat. The stranger smiled faintly, as though amused by Holmes' insistence. What I'm playing at, Mr. Holmes, he said slowly, is far more than your simple case of stolen gems. You see, the Opal of Wight is only one part of a much grander design, a design that, I assure you, you are not yet prepared to understand. Watson, who had been standing silently at Holmes' side, felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. There was something in the man's tone, an edge to his words that sent a chill down his spine. It was not the usual bravado of a criminal caught in the act. No, this was different. This was something much darker. And what, pray tell, might that be? Holmes inquired, his voice still calm, yet laced with the sharpness of a predator closing in on its prey. The man finally removed his hat, revealing a pair of piercing blue eyes. So intense they seemed to burn through the dim light of the room. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was his eyes, cold, calculating, and merciless, that made him formidable. My name is Inspector Hargrove, the man declared, his voice chillingly matter-of-fact. And I am the one who controls the threads you've been tugging at, Holmes. You've been poking around in matters that you don't fully comprehend, digging into a conspiracy that goes far beyond your understanding of mere jewels and stolen cargo. What you're involved in now, gentlemen, is a matter of national security, and it is one that is far beyond the grasp of your usual investigative methods. Holmes stood frozen for a moment, absorbing Hargrove's words. A few seconds passed, and then his lips curled into the faintest of smiles. National security? Holmes echoed, his voice soft but sharp. I think, Inspector, you underestimate the lengths to which I am willing to go to uncover the truth. You think you control the narrative, but you are only playing a part in a much larger game. You and your associates have made one critical error. You've underestimated the power of inquiry. Hargrove's lips twitched into a smile of his own, though it was one filled with menace. Oh, I don't underestimate you, Holmes. In fact, I admire your tenacity. But what you don't realize is that you are already too deep in this. This investigation, this search for the opal, is far beyond the boundaries of what you can handle. Holmes took a step forward, his expression hardening. I'm afraid you misunderstand, Hargrove. I am already more involved than you realize. The pieces I have uncovered connect you to more than just the opal. There are men behind you, men in positions of power, who will stop at nothing to see their plans come to fruition. Your rebellion, your conspiracy, is only the beginning. The question is, what are you hoping to achieve with all of this? Hargrove's eyes flickered with something that could only be described as a mixture of admiration and contempt. He regarded Holmes for a long moment before answering with a voice cold enough to freeze the very air around them. The rebellion is only a distraction, Mr. Holmes, Hargrove said slowly, his voice as smooth as the steel of a blade. The real objective is much more delicate. The Opal of Wight is not just a jewel, it's a key, one that will open the doors to a new world order. A world in which the British Empire's power is fractured, its influence diminished, and its grip on the colonies shattered. We are laying the groundwork for something far greater than you can fathom, something that will rewrite the rules of the Empire itself. Watson exchanged a quick glance with Holmes, who stood motionless, as though contemplating the full weight of Hargrove's words. This was not merely a plot for wealth, nor a scheme for personal power. This was an ideological crusade, a revolution that sought to undermine the very foundation of British authority. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. And what of Cartwright? Holmes asked, his voice carrying a quiet menace of its own. What is his role in all of this? Hargrove's gaze shifted to the jeweler, and for the first time, Cartwright visibly flinched. His usual composure seemed to crumble beneath Hargrove's scrutiny. Cartwright, Hargrove began, his tone almost patronizing, is merely a tool, a useful one, certainly. His connections to the East India Company and the transport of the opal provided us with an opportunity to send a message. He had his role to play, but that's all. In the grand scheme of things, he's insignificant. Cartwright's face went pale. I was only doing what I was told, he stammered, a glint of panic in his eyes. I didn't know what it was all for. I didn't. Enough, Hargrove snapped, cutting him off. Your role is finished. Cartwright, you've outlived your usefulness. The coldness in his voice sent a shudder down Watson's spine. As for you, Holmes, you can continue to play your little game, but know this. You are no longer dealing with mere criminals. You are meddling with forces that you cannot control. And if you persist in your investigation, you will regret it. Holmes took a deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Hargrove's. I don't think you fully understand, Inspector, he said, his voice as calm and unyielding as a rock. You've made a grave mistake by underestimating me. You may think you've won, but this, he gestured around the room, this is just the beginning. Hargrove stared at him, and for a moment, the room seemed to vibrate with the weight of their unspoken challenge. Then, as though coming to a decision, Hargrove smiled faintly. We'll see, Mr. Holmes. We'll see. Without another word, Hargrove turned and exited the room, his footsteps echoing ominously down the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Holmes and Watson in a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of a distant clock. Do you think he was telling the truth? Watson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes took a moment before responding, his mind already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. I believe so, Watson. But truth, in the hands of men like Hargrove, is a weapon. It can be twisted, manipulated, and used to further a cause. The rebellion, the conspiracy, it's all part of a larger scheme. And I suspect that the opal is only one small piece of the larger puzzle. Watson nodded, his unease growing. So, what now? Holmes looked toward the door where Hargrove had vanished, his eyes narrowing in thought. Now, Watson, we go deeper, and we do so with the full understanding that we are no longer merely solving a theft. We are uncovering a conspiracy that could change the very fabric of the empire. And so, with the game now set at a far higher level, Holmes' mind sharpened like a blade, determined to follow the trail wherever it led, even if that trail threatened to tear the very foundation of the empire as they knew it. Chapter 9: The Path to Revolution. The room fell silent after Hargrove's departure, the weight of his words lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, contemplating the implications of what had been said. Watson, ever watchful, was quick to break the silence. Holmes, this is far more than a mere jewel heist. You said it yourself, this conspiracy runs deep. But to what end? What could the opal possibly represent in all of this? Holmes remained at the window, staring out into the dusky streets of London. The fog had thickened since their conversation, and the gaslights flickered weakly through the haze. His mind was a whirl of possibilities, but one thing was clear: the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. I believe we've only seen the tip of the iceberg, Watson, Holmes said slowly, his voice calm but intense. The Opal of Wight is not just a symbol. It's part of something far more dangerous. Hargrove mentioned a revolution, a rebellion to shake the foundations of the empire. But what he didn't tell us was why. Why this particular gem and why now? Watson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. It's a powerful artifact, but is it really worth such an elaborate conspiracy? Surely there must be more to it than that. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing in thought. Exactly. It's not the gem itself, but what it represents. The opal is a key, Watson, a key to unlocking something far more valuable, the power to control the fate of nations. The rebels, or rather the insurgents, are not merely after wealth or power. They are after influence on a global scale. Watson's brow furrowed. But what could a single jewel have to do with that kind of power? Holmes turned from the window, his sharp gaze locking onto Watson's. Consider the history of the opal. It was once owned by a ruler of the Indian subcontinent, a jewel of such immense value that it could finance armies, sway rulers, and change the course of history. When it was brought to England, it was meant to be a symbol of imperial dominance, a prize in the collection of the British Empire. But what if it holds knowledge or a map, something more than just its aesthetic beauty? What if this jewel is the key to a larger network of ancient power? Watson stood and paced the room, trying to make sense of the pieces. So what you're saying is that the opal is a relic, not just a valuable gemstone. It could hold secrets to a hidden force, something that could ignite this rebellion. Precisely, Holmes replied, his tone sharp and focused. We have to understand that the Opal of Wight is not just a physical object. It is a symbol, a gateway. Whoever controls it will hold sway over forces far more significant than they appear. I suspect the insurgents, those involved with Hargrove, are well aware of this. They believe that by unlocking the secrets within it, they can destabilize the empire itself. But how do they intend to use it? Watson asked, his voice laced with concern. What could they possibly do with such knowledge? And why bring it to London? Why not use it in the colonies where they're fighting for independence? Holmes turned toward the desk and began pacing back and forth, the air crackling with tension. Because, Watson, London is the heart of the empire. If they can strike at the very core of the British establishment, they will have the power to fracture the colonial system from the inside. The opal must hold something. Perhaps a secret map, perhaps instructions for something far more dangerous that could bring about the collapse of the empire itself. We cannot underestimate the lengths to which these men will go. Watson crossed the room to join him at the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded streets below. And what now, Holmes? How do we stop them? Holmes paused for a moment before answering, his face taking on a hard, resolute expression. We must find the opal before they do. We need to uncover its secrets and ensure it does not fall into the wrong hands. But we cannot do this alone. We need allies, someone who understands the political landscape, someone with connections to the corridors of power. The door to the room opened with a soft creak, and a figure stepped inside. It was Inspector Lestrade, his face pale and drawn as if he had been traveling all night. His uniform was slightly askew, and his hat was pressed low over his brow. "Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice tight, "you need to come with me. There's been a development." Holmes looked up, his expression unreadable. "A development? What kind of development?" Lestrade hesitated, glancing at Watson before speaking in a hushed tone. "It's Cartwright. He's missing. Vanished without a trace." Holmes's brow furrowed. "Cartwright? But he was just here." "I know," Lestrade interrupted. "He was here this morning, speaking with his business partner, but now he's gone. His shop's been ransacked. It looks like someone was looking for something." "Do you suspect the insurgents?" Holmes asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. Lestrade nodded. "It's the only explanation that makes sense. The Opal, no doubt. It seems that whoever took him knows that Cartwright has more information. The trouble is, we have no idea where he's been taken." Holmes's eyes narrowed, the sharpness of his intellect already at work. "Then we must act swiftly. Watson, we'll go to Cartwright's shop and examine the scene. We must find out what was taken and why." Watson nodded, his face set in determination. "I'll fetch my coat." As Watson hurried to gather his belongings, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I'll need full access to Cartwright's records, any correspondence, and, most importantly, the names of those who have been frequenting his shop recently. If Cartwright was indeed involved with these rebels, he may have left us clues." Lestrade nodded gravely. "I'll make the arrangements. We'll meet you at the shop in an hour." Holmes gave a curt nod, then turned to Watson. "Come, Watson. We have a mystery to unravel. If we don't move quickly, the insurgents will be one step closer to unraveling the very fabric of the empire." The two men left the apartment, stepping out into the thickening fog of London. The city felt heavy with secrets, the quiet streets eerily deserted as they made their way toward Cartwright's shop. In the distance, the faint sound of a bell tolling the hour drifted through the air. Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, formulating theories, connecting dots. But one thing was certain: the game had changed. They were no longer dealing with petty criminals or thieves. They were up against a force that could alter the course of history itself. The streets of London were shrouded in a thick, damp fog as Holmes and Watson made their way through the winding alleys toward Cartwright's shop. The lamplights cast faint, ghostly glows, their lights swallowed by the mist, and the distant sound of the city seemed muffled under the weight of the fog. Holmes walked with an air of determination, his gait purposeful and swift, while Watson, though less accustomed to this pace, kept close behind, his mind still reeling from the revelations of the morning. "This fog," Watson muttered, almost to himself. "It's as if the city itself is hiding something." Holmes didn't break his stride. "Indeed, Watson, London has always had a way of concealing its secrets. But there is a darker undertone to this fog tonight. It's as though the city knows it is on the precipice of something far greater than mere crime." They arrived at Cartwright's shop, a modest, unassuming establishment nestled between two larger buildings in a quieter part of the city. The sign above the door, "Cartwright's Antiquities," hung crookedly as if dislodged from the evening's disturbance. The door itself, which was usually adorned with the finest brass handles, now seemed harnished and abandoned, as if someone had hastily left in a great hurry. Lestrade, already standing by the door, looked up with a grim expression as he saw Holmes and Watson approach. His eyes were wide with concern, and his hand was firmly resting on the door handle, as though reluctant to open it. "Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice low and tense, "I don't know what you'll find inside, but it's not good." Holmes gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the shop front. "I trust you've secured the scene?" Lestrade hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "We've taken basic precautions, but the damage seems extensive. Whoever was here knew exactly what they were after." "Then we shall see for ourselves," Holmes replied, his voice cool and precise. Holmes stepped forward, pushing the door open. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent street. As they entered, the scent of aged wood and dust greeted them. The dim lighting did little to mask the scene of chaos before them. Bookshelves that once lined the walls were now upturned, their contents scattered across the floor. Antique maps, scrolls, and rare trinkets lay abandoned. Some crushed underfoot, others tossed haphazardly across the floor. The small counter at the back of the shop was in disarray, papers scattered as though something had been urgently searched for. But the most telling sign of all was the broken display case in the center of the room. The glass shattered, its contents missing. "Look here," Lestrade said, pointing toward the empty case. "That's where Cartwright kept his most valuable items. There's nothing left but dust." Holmes knelt down, examining the shards of glass. His eyes scanned the surrounding area with an intensity that suggested he was piecing together an intricate puzzle. Whoever took the opal knew exactly where it was kept and how to bypass any obstacles. This was no common thief. Watson stepped cautiously forward, gingerly lifting a piece of paper that lay untouched amidst the wreckage. He read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. This is Cartwright's ledger. It lists several transactions, each one more curious than the last. Holmes rose to his feet, his gaze fixed on Watson. "What do the transactions reveal?" Watson glanced through the entries. "Many of them appear to be dealings with foreign nationals. A few names I don't recognize, but there's one here that stands out." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "A transaction with a man named Ram Singh, an individual whose name I've seen mentioned in the papers. He's been associated with rebellion movements in India." Holmes's expression darkened. "Singh. That name has come up before. He was rumored to have ties to the insurgents involved in the plans to destabilize the British Empire. But this ledger," he said, his voice trailing off as his mind raced, "is more than just a record of transactions. It's a map, Watson, a map that leads us towards something larger, perhaps to Cartwright's role in all this." Lestrade, who had been standing in the background, listening intently, stepped forward. "What are you suggesting, Holmes? That Cartwright was working with these insurgents all along?" Holmes turned toward him, his face hardening. "It is possible. Cartwright may have been more than just a merchant of antiquities. His knowledge of rare items could have made him a prime contact for individuals seeking to fund or hide their operations. The opal was likely just one piece of a larger puzzle, one that has just begun to take shape." Watson looked around the room, his gaze falling on the cluttered shelves. If Cartwright was involved, then we may have already missed the most important clue. What if he left something behind? Something hidden? Holmes walked purposefully toward the back of the room, his eyes flicking from one object to another. "We must search carefully. Cartwright was meticulous, and if he was aware that someone, was after him, he would have hidden anything of value." He began to sift through the papers and objects scattered around the back counter, moving with the precision of a surgeon. He paused when he reached an old dust-covered ledger at the very back, wedged between a stack of ancient tomes. The cover was worn, and as Holmes opened it, a faint creak of binding echoed in the silent room. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes scanned the text quickly. "Here it is," he murmured under his breath. "What is it?" Watson asked, stepping closer. Holmes turned the ledger toward Watson, pointing to a series of entries. "These aren't ordinary business dealings. They're coded references to specific locations, places tied to unrest in India. And this particular symbol," Holmes tapped the page with his finger, "it's a map reference, a location near the coast of India, far from any major trading post. This is where the insurgents are planning to make their move." Lestrade stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "What does this mean, Holmes? Do you think Cartwright was trying to warn us?" Holmes's face tightened, his eyes alight with focus. "He may have been, but he also may have been part of the very network we are hunting. It's clear that he was involved in something far greater than simple commerce." Watson looked at Holmes, unease creeping into his voice. "What now? How do we stop them?" Holmes turned to face the inspector, his expression resolute. "Now we go to India, and we uncover the truth before these insurgents can ignite the rebellion they are planning." Lestrade's face went pale. "India? But that's—" "There is no time for hesitation," Holmes interrupted. "We will need to gather our resources, make the necessary arrangements, and act swiftly. The opal is not just a piece of jewelry. It is a key that unlocks the potential for unimaginable chaos." The three men stood together in the wreckage of Cartwright's shop, the weight of their task heavy upon them. Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, and Watson's heart beat faster as the realization sank in. Their lives were about to change forever. And the world, it seemed, was on the brink of an upheaval that none of them could have fully anticipated. Chapter X, The Ship to the East. The days passed quickly, and before long, the preparations for their journey were complete. The fog that had once engulfed London had lifted, but in its place, an ominous heaviness hung in the air. A feeling that their pursuit of the opal, and the far more treacherous path it had revealed, was about to carry them into unknown dangers. Sherlock Holmes, ever the master of meticulous detail, had arranged for their travel to India with a precision that was unparalleled. The passage had been secured aboard the HMS Scepter, a British merchant ship bound for Calcutta, where the web of intrigue surrounding the opal was thought to be centered. As Holmes had so often said, the journey is just as vital as the destination, and so it was that they now stood on the crowded docks of London's East End, preparing to set sail. Dr. Watson, his grip firm on his medical bag, looked up at the massive ship looming before him, its sails and masts casting long shadows over the wooden deck. The ship, though sturdy, looked like a behemoth poised to cut through the vast, uncharted waters of the Indian Ocean. Holmes, dressed in his usual dark attire with his bowler hat perched at a rakish angle, turned to Watson with a slight smirk on his face. "Are you prepared for the discomforts of sea travel, Watson? I do hope you packed appropriately." "I've packed as best I could, Holmes," Watson replied, adjusting his collar and tightening his grip on the strap of his bag. "I imagine it will be much like our journey to the continent some years ago, but I must admit I have more trepidation about the tasks ahead than the ship's accommodations." Holmes's eyes narrowed in thought. "The seas will be uncomfortable, as you say, but they will not be nearly as taxing as the work we will be called upon to do once we arrive in India. The political unrest, the conspiracy, and the insurgents, these will be the true tests of our resolve." As they boarded the ship and made their way to their quarters, Watson could see Holmes's mind already racing with thoughts of their mission. Holmes, as always, appeared unaffected by the prospect of travel. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned every detail of the ship, the sailors moving swiftly along the rigging, the cargo being loaded into the hold, the officers giving orders with efficient precision. There was nothing that escaped his attention. Their quarters, though humble, were comfortable enough to ensure they could rest for the long journey ahead. As night fell, Watson lay in his bunk, trying to sleep amidst the creaking of the ship and the hum of the sailors' voices outside. But his mind wandered back to the events of the past week. He thought of Cartwright, the enigmatic antiquities dealer whose shop had been ransacked, and the strange ledger that had revealed far more than they had bargained for. The opal had once been a mere gem, precious, beautiful, and coveted, but now it was the symbol of something far more sinister, a rebellion in the making, an empire on the brink of revolution. The days at sea passed slowly, the constant rocking of the ship leaving Watson feeling more than a little queasy. Holmes, however, seemed unaffected, his mind constantly at work, even on the rolling deck. He spent hours reading through newspapers, occasionally making cryptic notes in his journal, and even more hours deep in thought as he sat with his back to the ship's railing, staring out at the endless horizon. Holmes. Watson ventured one afternoon, breaking the silence between them as they sat on the upper deck. "What do you make of the connection between Cartwright and the rebellion? Do you think he was involved in organizing this insurgency, or was he merely a pawn?" Holmes turned his piercing gaze toward Watson, the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I believe Cartwright was no pawn, Watson. He may not have been the architect of the rebellion, but he was certainly more than just a simple antiquities dealer. His dealings with Ram Singh, the coded entries in his ledger, these point to a man deeply embedded in the machinations of something far more dangerous than we had imagined." Watson raised an eyebrow. "But why the opal? What was so special about that particular gem?" Holmes tilted his head thoughtfully. "The opal, as I've come to understand it, was no mere adornment. It was a symbol, a key to unlocking something larger. A treasure of such value would have been a perfect piece to hide in plain sight, a distraction for the authorities while the true machinations of the rebellion took shape." And the rebels? Watson asked, his curiosity piqued. Do you believe they intend to use the opal to fund their cause? Holmes gave a slight nod. Indeed, Watson. A gem of such value could be easily converted into the necessary funds to procure weapons, to finance insurgents. Cartwright's dealings with Singh suggest that he was aiding in this process. Perhaps he thought the gem would be an ideal way to smuggle money or supplies under the guise of a rare artifact. Watson shifted uncomfortably. But why the secrecy? Why go to such lengths to hide these transactions? Secrecy is a necessity for those involved in treason acts, Holmes replied dryly. To raise suspicion would have led to arrests. To move freely, Cartwright needed to disguise his true activities. And that, my dear Watson, is why we must reach India before it is too late. The days at sea eventually turned into weeks, and the shores of India slowly came into view. The HMS Scepter sailed into the bustling port of Calcutta, the ship's arrival met by the loud clamor of dockworkers and the cries of hawkers selling their goods. Holmes's eyes gleamed with anticipation, for he knew their investigation was far from over. They disembarked onto the busy streets, the smells of spices and incense filling the air. The heat was overwhelming, and the constant buzz of activity made London seem a world away. As they made their way through the crowded streets, Watson could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on him. This was no longer a simple investigation into a stolen gem. This was a race against time to uncover a conspiracy that threatened the very heart of the British Empire. Holmes, his sharp eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, led the way through the bustling streets. They passed by markets selling exotic fruits, merchants calling out to potential buyers, and locals haggling over goods. The chaos of Calcutta was unlike anything Watson had ever experienced, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer scale of it all. But amidst the clamor, Holmes's voice broke through, his tone low and focused. We have our work cut out for us, Watson. But remember, the opal is not just a treasure. It is the key to something far more dangerous. We must tread carefully. And so with the heat of India pressing in on them, they began their search, knowing full well that the true battle for the future of the British Empire was just beginning. Chapter 11, The Web Tightens. The streets of Calcutta stretched before them like a labyrinth, winding and twisting in directions that seemed to contradict reason itself. Holmes walked with the same deliberate, purposeful pace as always, but his eyes were sharp and calculating, scanning the faces of the crowds, noting every little detail that could be useful. Dr. Watson, though equally alert, felt the oppressive weight of the humidity, the clamor of voices, and the strange newness of the environment weighing on him. The entire city seemed like a cacophony of sights and sounds, each moment a reminder of how far they had traveled from their quiet life in London. Holmes stopped abruptly, his keen eyes narrowing as he turned towards a small, nondescript building tucked into a corner of the street. It was a curiously mundane structure for a city so vibrant, the sort of building that would have gone unnoticed by any ordinary passerby. But for Sherlock Holmes, there was no such thing as an ordinary building. Every building had a story, and this one in particular was important. We must make our inquiries here, Watson, he said, his voice steady and quiet as he led the way. The door was weathered, with chipped paint and a faded sign hanging above it that read, P. Abhijit, Antiquities and Curios. Holmes pushed the door open without hesitation, and they entered the shop. The interior was dark and musty, with a smell of aged wood and dust, thick in the air. Rows of shelves were crammed with all manner of objects, odd sculptures, carved wooden masks, tarnished silverware, and faded scrolls. The only light came from a few flickering oil lamps placed here and there. It was exactly the sort of establishment where one might find things hidden in plain sight. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a long, wispy beard and deeply wrinkled skin. His eyes were bright and watchful, though his frame suggested that he had seen many decades of life. He greeted them with a quick nod, not particularly surprised by their entrance. "I am Mr. Abhijit," he said in a soft, accented voice. "Can I assist you, gentlemen?" Holmes's gaze never wavered as he stepped forward. "I trust that you deal in rare and valuable items, Mr. Abhijit." The old man chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with something that was not quite amusement. "Rare, yes. Valuable. It depends on the eyes of the beholder. What brings you here today? Watson watched Holmes closely, knowing that his companion was already assessing the man with his customary attention to detail. It was clear that Holmes suspected something. Abhijit was no mere antiquities dealer, and there was a deeper connection between him and the conspiracy they were chasing. "We are looking for information," Holmes continued, his voice low and measured. "Information regarding a certain gem, a rare opal, known as the Opal of Wight. It was recently in the possession of a London merchant, Cartwright. I believe you are familiar with his dealings." Abhijit's face stiffened for a moment, a flash of recognition in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a mask of indifference. "Cartwright," he murmured, almost as if testing the name on his tongue. "A respected dealer, to be sure. But I cannot say I know much of him. His business is not my concern." Holmes was unperturbed. "I think you may be underestimating the importance of our inquiry, Mr. Abhijit. This opal was stolen, and I have reason to believe it passed through your hands, either directly or indirectly. I am not here to make accusations, but to uncover the truth." Abhijit remained silent for a moment, his gaze flicking nervously to the side. Then, with a resigned sigh, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It is true that I have dealt with Cartwright in the past, but not for many months, not since he began pursuing this particular treasure. As for the opal, it is not something I would ever consider selling. The price it commands would attract far too much attention. But I do know of its significance." "Go on," Holmes urged, his voice steady but pressing. "The opal," Abhijit continued, his eyes darting about as though to ensure no one was listening, "was never just a gemstone. It was the key to something far more dangerous, something that could shake the foundations of the empire. But I will say no more on that here." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand. I think we may have come to an agreement, Mr. Abhijit. However, I would caution you. Secrets are only safe for so long. If you wish to stay out of this matter, you would do well to be transparent with us now." The old man's eyes flickered with something akin to fear, but he regained his composure quickly. "There is a tavern," he said softly, "in the east end of Calcutta. It is run by a man named Gyan. If you seek answers, that is where you will find them. But I warn you, gentlemen, Gyan's business is not one of honesty. Be prepared for anything." Holmes's eyes lit up with a quiet intensity. "Gyan, you say? Very well, Mr. Abhijit. We shall pay this tavern a visit." The tavern was located in the more rundown section of the East End, far from the bustling city center. As they approached, Watson could feel the weight of the city's poverty pressing in on them. The air was thick with the stench of refuse and sweat. The buildings around them were dilapidated, with crumbling facades and peeling paint. It was a world that seemed entirely disconnected from the wealth and influence of British rule that Holmes had encountered earlier in the city. As they neared the tavern, Holmes turned to Watson. "This is it, Watson. This is where the answers we seek may lie." They stepped into the tavern, the door creaking on its hinges. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and the murmur of hushed conversations. The bar was manned by a stout, balding man who looked up briefly as they entered, then went back to polishing a glass with a rag. Holmes approached the bar with his usual calm assurance, and Watson followed closely behind. "I am looking for Gyan," Holmes said, his voice even but firm. The bartender glanced up briefly before nodding toward the far corner of the room, where a man sat alone, sipping from a cup. His dark eyes regarded them with a calculating gaze, and there was something about the way he held himself, too calm, too deliberate, that suggested he was no ordinary tavern keeper. Gyan was a man of average height, dressed in simple, worn clothes, but his posture and the way he observed his surroundings told a different story. He was someone who had seen more than his fair share of danger, and perhaps someone who had orchestrated it. Holmes and Watson made their way toward him. As they sat at the table, Gyan's lips curled into a thin smile, but it was not one of warmth. There was something unsettling about the way he sized them up, as though he had already assessed their worth, or their danger. "You are looking for answers, I presume?" Gyan asked, his voice low and controlled. Holmes met his gaze squarely. "Indeed, and I believe you can provide them." John's eyes glinted with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. the smoke from his cigarette curling around his face as he leaned back in his chair. The dim light from a flickering lantern above cast deep shadows across his sharp features, making him appear more like a man who lived in the shadows than one who merely frequented them. "You are confident," he said, his voice smooth but with an undertone that was hard to place. "Most people who come to me seeking answers leave with more questions. It is always the way of things in this business." Holmes studied him with an intensity that seemed to pierce the very air between them. "I do not seek answers for their own sake," he said calmly, "but to piece together a larger puzzle. We are investigating the theft of a rare gem, the Opal of Wight, a gem of no ordinary worth, I believe, but one of great significance, both to those who possess it and to those who would see it disappear." Jan's expression barely flickered. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing brighter in the low light, and exhaled in a steady stream that wafted toward the ceiling. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze drifting toward the bar as if contemplating something far off. Finally, his eyes returned to Holmes. "You are not wrong," Jan said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The Opal of Wight is no mere gem. It is a key, a symbol of power in the right hands. I do not know who took it, but I can tell you that it is not only thieves who desire it. There are other forces at play, forces that you, I suspect, have yet to fully comprehend." Holmes nodded, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips, as if he were savoring a particularly challenging riddle. "Go on." Jan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the worn wooden table, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "The gem is not merely a thing of beauty. It is a relic from a time long past, said to have been in the possession of an ancient kingdom, lost to history. Some believe it holds more than just monetary value. It is said to be imbued with power, a power capable of shifting the balance of the colonies. But this is not a tale told in the open. It is whispered among those who have interests that align more with rebellion than with the law." Watson, who had been silent up until now, exchanged a glance with Holmes. "Rebellion?" he asked, his voice betraying his growing concern. "What do you mean by that? What kind of power are we speaking of?" Jan's smile was cold, and there was a hint of something dangerous lurking behind it. "You see, Dr. Watson, the British Empire is not as stable as it seems. There are those among us who seek to disrupt that stability, to spark a fire that would spread through the colonies, stirring unrest among the people, undermining the authority of the crown. The opal is said to be part of a larger plan, one that involves more than just wealth. It is a symbol to rally behind, a piece that can unite different factions with a common cause." Holmes leaned in slightly, his steely gaze never leaving Jan's face. "And you are telling me this because—" "Because," Jan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you cannot fight shadows with nothing but light. If you wish to understand the forces at work, you must be prepared to step into the darkness. The opal is not simply a treasure, it is a catalyst. It is the reason certain people are willing to risk everything to possess it." Holmes's expression hardened, the wheels of his mind turning rapidly as he processed the new information. "And where do you fit into all of this, Jan?" The tavern keeper's smile deepened, but there was no humor in it. "I have no interest in politics, Mr. Holmes, but I know how power works. I know who seeks it, who will pay for it, and who will destroy for it. I am a businessman, nothing more. But even a businessman cannot ignore the price of betrayal." Holmes studied Jan for a long moment, his eyes searching for any signs of deceit. "You are not merely a businessman, Mr. Jan. You are a man with connections, and those connections bring you information, useful information. That is why we are here." Jan's fingers tapped lightly on the table, and he gave a slight nod, conceding Holmes's point. "Perhaps. I do have my sources, but not all knowledge is worth having, Mr. Holmes. Some things are better left buried." Holmes's tone shifted, becoming more insistent. "I am not here to dig into your personal affairs, Jan. I am here because you know something that could prevent a disaster." "And what disaster is that?" Jan asked, genuinely curious now, his eyes narrowing with interest. "The opal is just a piece of a much larger puzzle," Holmes replied, his voice low and deliberate. "A conspiracy, one that could span across continents and cost thousands of lives. I am not concerned with treasure, Mr. John. I am concerned with stopping those who would exploit it for bloodshed. Now, tell me everything you know about the people behind this plot." Gyan leaned back in his chair again, his face unreadable. For several long moments he was silent, his fingers drumming absently on the edge of his glass. Then, as if weighing the cost of his next words, he spoke. "There is a man," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A man known only as Singh. He is the key to this whole affair. He is the one who is moving the Opal, using it to finance a rebellion. But Singh is no ordinary man. He is a shadow in the dark, a figure who does not hesitate to eliminate those who cross him." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Singh, do you have any idea where I can find him?" Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze focused ahead as they walked through the fog-shrouded streets. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the otherwise quiet night, and the air seemed thick with anticipation. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low but steady. "John's information is valuable, Watson, but we must approach it with caution. Singh is not a man of simple ambition. His actions are calculated, deliberate. This is not a rebellion driven by mere discontent. It is a carefully constructed plan, likely backed by forces that operate from the shadows. There are people who stand to gain much more than just the Opal." Watson looked over at Holmes, sensing the weight of his words. "You think there's more to this than just the Opal? More than just the rebellion?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "Indeed. The Opal, as Gian mentioned, is a symbol. It represents a shift in power, but it is only the beginning. Singh is using it to finance something much larger, something that could destabilize the entire empire. Whoever controls this Opal controls a great deal more than just a gemstone. They control a cause, a movement." He paused briefly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "This is no ordinary conspiracy, Watson. If we are to stop it, we must be prepared to face forces far beyond the typical criminals we encounter." Watson nodded, his expression serious. "And the warehouse at the docks? Do you think we'll find Singh there?" Holmes's gaze hardened as they approached the area in question. "We have little choice but to investigate. If Singh is indeed using this location to move goods from the east, it is likely to be a key part of the operation. But be cautious. Singh is not a man who leaves anything to chance, and anyone associated with him will be equally dangerous." The fog seemed to grow denser as they neared the docks, the dim light from the gas lamps barely enough to guide their path. Holmes and Watson both felt the weight of the situation bearing down on them, but neither hesitated. They were close, and the answers they sought were within reach. The Opal, with its immense value, could be a powerful rallying symbol, but that did not explain the web of intrigue surrounding it, nor did it explain the scope of the conspiracy that was slowly unfolding before them. "It is difficult to say, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice steady but thoughtful. "We know the Opal is not merely a jewel to be sold. It is a means to an end, a tool, if you will, to incite chaos. But we must also consider the possibility that Singh is only a pawn in a much larger game. The Opal is merely the first move." "Then who, Holmes?" Watson pressed, glancing at the darkened warehouses that loomed before them, their silhouettes barely discernible in the fog. "Who is pulling the strings?" Holmes turned his sharp eyes on Watson. "That is what we must discover, my dear friend, one step at a time." They arrived at the entrance to the dockyard, a large iron gate standing open as if it had been left unguarded intentionally. Holmes surveyed the area with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to danger, his gaze sweeping over the loading docks and the adjacent buildings. The warehouse they were looking for was a squat, imposing structure at the far end of the yard. It was dark, with no signs of movement, but Holmes could sense the tension in the air, the kind of silence that only came before something significant. "We'll need to be cautious," Holmes murmured, leading the way toward the building. "There's no telling how many people might be inside, or what they're capable of." Watson nodded, his hand instinctively drifting toward the revolver tucked under his coat. "I'll follow your lead, Holmes." The two men approached the warehouse, their footsteps muffled on the gravel. Holmes moved with the fluidity of a cat, his movements sharp and deliberate, while Watson kept close behind, his hand on the hilt of his weapon. Holmes paused at the entrance of the building, pressing his ear against the thick wooden door. He stood motionless for a long moment, listening intently for any sounds that might indicate what lay beyond. A faint rustling reached his ears, followed by a muffled voice, but nothing more. It was enough to tell him that the warehouse was not entirely empty. "There's movement inside," Holmes whispered. "We'll need to be swift." He turned the handle slowly, pushing the door open just enough for them to slip inside. The warehouse was vast, filled with crates stacked high and a thick layer of dust on the floor. The air smelled of salt water and old wood, with a faint tang of metal that hinted at the contents of the crates. The only light came from a small lantern in the far corner, casting long shadows across the space. Holmes motioned for Watson to stay close as they crept further into the warehouse. They moved like shadows, blending into the darkness, their footsteps barely audible against the wooden floor. The faint sounds of conversation grew clearer as they advanced. Two men's voices, low and indistinct, echoed from a distant corner of the warehouse. Holmes's sharp mind immediately began piecing together the fragments of sound, analyzing the tone and cadence of the voices. He was close now, close to uncovering the first real clue in the case. As they approached the source of the voices, Holmes motioned for Watson to stop. The two of them hid behind a stack of crates, peering out cautiously to observe what was unfolding. In the dim light, two figures stood near a table, examining something with great care. One of them was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a heavy coat that looked out of place in the muggy warmth of the warehouse. His face was partially obscured by a thick beard, but his hands were steady and precise as he turned a large object over in his palms. The other man, smaller and more wiry, wore a loose, almost ragged shirt, and his eyes darted nervously around the room as if he were expecting someone. Holmes's sharp eyes locked on the object in the tall man's hand, a small wooden box. He could see the faint outline of something inside it, something that seemed too valuable, too delicate to be kept in such a crude container. The shape of the object was unmistakable, a gem, smooth and polished, with a faint opalescent gleam. "The opal," Holmes muttered, barely above a whisper. Watson's hand tightened around the revolver's grip. "Are we going in now, then?" Holmes shook his head. "Patience, Watson. We need to know more. There's something else here. Something we haven't yet uncovered." They continued to watch, the tension between them palpable. The two men by the table continued to speak, though their words were still too muffled to decipher. But Holmes's attention was focused now on the taller man, whose actions seemed deliberate and methodical. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the two men moved away from the table, disappearing into the shadows at the back of the warehouse. Holmes gestured to Watson, signaling that it was time to move. "We'll follow them," Holmes whispered, "but we must remain silent. If they know we're here, we lose the advantage." They crept forward, moving swiftly through the shadows toward the back of the warehouse. The air grew colder, the musty scent of the space giving way to the sharp tang of metal and oil. Every step felt heavier than the last as they neared the back door, where the two men had vanished. Just as they reached the threshold of the door, the sound of a creaking floorboard echoed through the warehouse. The hair on the back of Watson's neck stood on end. Someone was coming. Holmes looked at Watson, a knowing glance passing between them. "Prepare yourself," Holmes whispered, drawing his own revolver from under his coat. And then, without another word, the door swung open with a soft groan, revealing the shadowy figure of a man who had stepped into the dim light. The figure that emerged from the shadows was tall, with the broad shoulders of a man accustomed to hard labor, but there was something about him that didn't quite match the rough and rugged surroundings of the dockside warehouse. His face was obscured by the dark of the doorway, but his movements were measured, deliberate, calculated. Holmes remained perfectly still, his back pressed against the cold stone wall, as Watson's hand clenched tighter around his revolver, a quiet tension growing in the space between them. Holmes, however, was unperturbed, his keen eyes locked onto the shadowy figure, watching, waiting, calculating. "Who goes there?" the figure called out, his voice rich with an accent Holmes couldn't place at first. He paused, listening intently. A cold gust of wind stirred the fog outside, creeping through the cracks in the walls. The door swung just slightly, the creak echoing across the space, but it was enough to reveal a hint of the man's silhouette. He was clad in a long, dark coat, the hem trailing on the floor, but the most curious detail about him was the glint of metal shining just above his hip, a sword cane. "Stay where you are!" Holmes whispered sharply to Watson, his eyes never leaving the figure. Watson nodded and remained still, not daring to make a sound. The man took a cautious step forward into the warehouse, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He stopped in front of the crate, the light from the lantern flickering across his face for the first time. His features were sharp, angular with a cold, steely gaze. The first impression Holmes had of him was one of calculated menace, a man who had known danger too long to show fear. "Mr. Singh?" Holmes called out from the shadows, his voice calm but firm. He had no time for subtlety, not with this kind of situation. He needed answers, quickly, decisively. The man's head jerked up in surprise, his hand moving instinctively to the sword cane at his side. For a split second, the warehouse seemed frozen in time. The fog outside pressing in like a living thing, the silence broken only by the slow, deliberate breath of the two men hiding behind the crates. "You were expecting me, I presume?" Holmes continued, stepping forward slowly from his hiding place. Watson remained close, his gun ready but his eyes studying the man before them. The man straightened, his stance shifting from defensive to relaxed as he seemed to size up Holmes. "I had wondered when the great detective would appear," he said in a smooth voice, tinged with an almost mocking amusement. "Sherlock Holmes, no doubt. Your reputation precedes you." Holmes didn't flinch. "I don't suppose we could make this conversation civil, could we?" His eyes scanned the man's features. There was no immediate sign of aggression left, but the subtle tension in his shoulders told Holmes that the situation could change in an instant. "You're a long way from the comforts of London," the man said, his voice now cold and dismissive. "And yet, you come here seeking something. What is it? The opal?" He raised an eyebrow, his expression becoming more amused. "You already know the answer to that, don't you?" Holmes replied, his voice low, but edged with intent. "But I have to ask, why steal it in the first place? What role does the Opal of Wight play in all of this?" The man smirked, and then he stepped forward, closer to Holmes, before coming to a halt just a few paces away. "It's not the opal that matters," he said, his eyes narrowing in a dangerous glint. "It's what it represents, what it can do. The opal is merely the beginning, Sherlock. The storm has already begun." Holmes studied the man carefully, noting the hint of anxiety beneath his words, the slight shift in his gaze that spoke of secrets yet to be revealed. He had no doubt that the man knew more than he was letting on. The mention of a storm was telling, a metaphor, no doubt, for the unrest brewing in the colonies. But what did it mean for Singh to have such knowledge? And why speak so openly? "You're involved in something far deeper than simple theft, aren't you?" Holmes pressed, his voice taking on a more commanding tone. "What's your role in all of this? Are you financing a rebellion in India? Or are you merely another cog in a much larger wheel?" Singh's expression flickered, but only for a moment. He stepped back slowly, his gaze still locked with Holmes. "You're an astute man, Holmes, but you're not the only one who can see patterns. Yes, I am involved, but not as you think. The opal, its theft, it's only a piece of a much grander scheme, a scheme that you will never understand." Holmes's mind raced, but his exterior remained calm and collected. He had heard enough. The pieces were falling into place, albeit slowly. The rebellion Singh spoke of wasn't just in India. No, this was a wider plot, one that sought to disrupt the very fabric of the British Empire. A rebellion on multiple fronts, military, political, and economic. "You speak in riddles," Holmes said, his voice flat. "But I need facts. I need answers. What is the end game here?" Singh's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "The end game? Why, Mr. Holmes? The end game is inevitable. We will see the downfall of the empire, not through violence alone, but through something far more insidious, the manipulation of wealth, of influence. The opal is only the beginning of the leverage we need. With it, we'll control more than just the East. We'll control the very flow of power." Watson, who had been listening intently, now stepped forward, his voice laced with disbelief. "You think you can topple an empire with a gem? With these dark dealings?" Singh's gaze flicked to Watson, and then back to Holmes. "I have no need to explain myself to you, Doctor. You've seen the surface. You've seen what we wanted you to see. But beneath it all lies a network of power, men and women across the world who believe in our cause. We will see a world where the British no longer rule, where others rise in their place." Holmes regarded him carefully, calculating his next move. "And you truly believe that you can incite such a rebellion with a few men and a handful of stolen jewels? Do you think the people will simply rally behind you? It sounds naive." Singh's eyes hardened. "Naivety is a luxury for those who sit comfortably in their ivory towers, Mr. Holmes. I have seen what true suffering is. And I have seen how men and women will fight for freedom, how they will rise when the time comes." Holmes narrowed his eyes, seeing a flicker of something deeper in Singh's eyes. The man believed in his cause, and that made him dangerous. Not for his plans, perhaps, but for his ability to inspire others to act on them. "You are deluded," Holmes said quietly. "But if you insist on this path, there will be consequences. You may think you've seen the world's true suffering, but you've yet to face the consequences of your actions. You will be caught." Singh's smile remained, though it was more feral now, a slight sneer creeping across his features. "We shall see, Mr. Holmes. We shall see." With that, Singh turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the vast, empty warehouse. Holmes and Watson remained in the shadows, watching him disappear into the fog once more. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. Chapter 13. The Web Unravels. The early morning mist clung to the cobbled streets of London, an oppressive blanket that dampened the sound of carriages and footfalls. Holmes and Watson stood in the doorway of their Baker Street apartment, both quiet for a moment as they watched the fog swirl around the lantern posts, each lost in their thoughts. The events of the night before had shaken them more than either would have expected. For the first time in days, Holmes appeared to be in a rare moment of silence. His usual energy had been replaced by an almost meditative stillness. Watson, ever the curious companion, broke the silence. "Holmes, you said Singh's actions were part of a much larger conspiracy, but what exactly are we dealing with here? I still don't understand how a single gem, even one as valuable as the Opal of Wight, could fuel such an elaborate plot." Holmes turned to face him, his eyes focused and alert as ever. "The opal is but a symbol, Watson. A powerful one, yes, but it is the machinations behind it that truly matter. Singh is only a player in a much grander scheme, a scheme that involves far more than just personal gain. We are dealing with a network of men and women who wish to reshape the balance of power, both here in Britain and in the colonies." Watson furrowed his brow, still trying to process the complexity of the situation. But how do they plan to achieve this? What leverage does a gemstone give them? Holmes's lips twitched into a slight smile, though it lacked the usual mirth. "That is the question, my dear Watson. The opal is no ordinary gem. It's not just a rare and valuable object. It holds significance far beyond its material worth. It's a key that unlocks access to a system of wealth, power, and influence that can topple governments. The opal, along with the rest of their network, will give them control over trade routes, military funding, and even the colonies themselves." Watson's eyes widened. "You mean to say they intend to use this gem to finance a rebellion? To destabilize the empire from within?" "Exactly," Holmes replied, stepping away from the window and pacing toward the desk. He picked up a piece of parchment, a map of the East Indies that had been scrawled with notations, lines, and marks that Watson had not fully deciphered. "They don't want to just cause a revolution. They want to create a shadow economy, one that operates outside the reach of Britain's power. This opal will be a conduit for that. The gem itself is tied to a series of clandestine deals, covert alliances, and private fortunes that stretch from the docks of London to the deepest reaches of the Indian subcontinent. It is not just about money, Watson. It is about control." The weight of Holmes's words hung heavy in the air as Watson absorbed the magnitude of what they were now facing. For all his experience in the world of medicine and the military, Watson had never quite grasped the true extent of the power struggles that occurred in the halls of political intrigue. But standing here now, with the implications of their investigation beginning to take shape, he felt the full force of the conspiracy bearing down on them. "We have to find Singh," Watson said, his voice sharp with a sense of urgency. He holds the key to all of this, doesn't he? Holmes nodded, turning back to the window. The fog had begun to dissipate slightly, revealing the bustle of London's early morning trade. Singh is merely the tip of the iceberg. If we can uncover his associates, we might be able to unravel the entire operation. But as you rightly pointed out, Watson, we are dealing with men and women who are highly skilled at deception. We can't simply rely on the usual methods. We'll need to dig deeper, into places where the law does not reach. Later that morning, the two men made their way through the labyrinthine streets of the East End. The area, once a thriving port for trade, now lay in shadow, its cobbled streets slick with grime and its buildings sagging with age. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and fish, and the people who lived here moved quickly, their faces weary and suspicious of outsiders. Holmes led the way, his coat flaring out behind him as he navigated the narrow alleyways with ease. Watson, slightly less accustomed to this part of London, struggled to keep pace. The tension in the air was palpable, and the weight of their investigation seemed to settle over them both as they walked. They arrived at a small tavern tucked between two buildings, a ramshackle structure with windows that looked as though they hadn't been cleaned in years. The sign outside, "The Merman's Rest," swayed in the breeze, creaking with every gust. Holmes pushed open the door, and the sound of hushed voices and the clinking of glasses filled their ears. The tavern was dimly lit, smoke curling lazily from pipes and candles. It was the kind of place where secrets were traded as easily as drinks. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The tavern was filled with rough-looking men, some hunched over tables, others standing in groups, engaged in quiet conversations. At the far end of the room, a figure caught Holmes's attention, his back to them, hunched over a table, scribbling in a ledger. "That's our man," Holmes said, nodding toward the figure. "The one who will lead us to the heart of this conspiracy." Watson raised an eyebrow. "How can you be so sure?" Holmes smiled, though it was tight and focused. "The ledger. That's not just any bookkeeping. That's a record of deals, contacts, and transactions, none of which should be written down in a place like this. It's an act of carelessness, Watson, and it's no accident." The two men approached cautiously, their steps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that covered the floor. As they drew closer, the figure turned slightly, revealing a face that Watson immediately recognized. Vikram Patel, a known associate of Singh. Patel looked up, his eyes narrowing as he met Holmes's gaze. He made no attempt to hide his recognition, nor did he make any move to flee. Instead, he simply closed the ledger with a snap and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Holmes," he said with a wry smile, his voice low and laden with amusement. "I wondered when you would show up. I suppose you're here for answers." Holmes didn't flinch. "You're involved in something far more dangerous than you realize, Patel, and I'm afraid you've underestimated what we can uncover." Patel chuckled softly, his fingers tapping the surface of the table. "Underestimate? Holmes, you have no idea what you're dealing with, but I'm sure you'll find out soon enough." Holmes's eyes locked onto Patel's. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Patel. It's not just your life at stake. You're part of something that could destroy everything you've worked for. And unless you tell me everything you know, I'm afraid that destruction will come much sooner than you think." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. For a moment, the room fell silent, save for the murmur of the other patrons, unaware of the tension building in their midst. Patel's smile faltered slightly, but he remained unshaken. "You're too late, Holmes. The pieces are already in motion. The Opal, it's only the beginning." Holmes leaned in slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Then we'll stop the pieces from falling into place, and you'll tell me exactly what role you've played in it all." Patel's eyes glinted with a mix of defiance and something else, perhaps a measure of fear. "You think you can stop us? You've only seen the surface of it, Sherlock. There's a much larger picture, and you're too late to change it." Holmes remained silent for a moment, assessing Patel carefully. Then, without warning, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. It was a map of the East Indies, just like the one from his desk at Baker Street. The ink on it was fresh, but the lines had been drawn with precision. Holmes slid it across the table. "Your move, Patel. Holmes said quietly. Patel's eyes flicked to the map and then back to Holmes. The moment of hesitation was brief, but it spoke volumes. The game was on. Patel sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table, his gaze flicking between the map and Holmes. For a moment, it seemed as though he might offer an answer, but instead, he chose silence, his defiance still very much intact. Holmes, never one to be deterred, maintained his gaze, his expression unreadable. Watson, sensing the growing tension, shifted his weight slightly but remained in his place, prepared for whatever came next. Patel broke the silence first. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," he said, his voice carrying the slightest hint of amusement. "But persistence won't win you this game, Holmes. You've only just scratched the surface." Holmes's lips tightened into a thin line. "We've been scratching at the edges long enough, Patel. You've made it clear there's more to this than a stolen gem. So why don't you save us both some time? Tell us what you know, and perhaps we can find a way to avoid further unnecessary complications." The corners of Patel's lips curled into a sly grin. "You think I'm the key, don't you? That I hold the answers to everything. But you're wrong, Holmes. I'm not the mastermind. I'm just a cog in the wheel. There's a much larger force at work here, a force you won't be able to stop." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then tell me about this larger force, and I'll see if I agree with you." Patel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he studied Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You're a man of logic, Holmes. You've spent your life unraveling mysteries, solving problems, and exposing the dark underbelly of society. But you've never had to deal with something like this. This is bigger than you, bigger than the Empire itself." He paused, his gaze flicking to Watson, who had been listening intently before turning back to Holmes. "This isn't just about money, Holmes. It's not just about the colonies, or a revolution, or any of the petty schemes you think are behind all of this. It's about something far more profound." Holmes's expression remained unchanged. "Go on," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper. "Enlighten me." Patel's smile deepened as he leaned back in his chair again, his hands steepling together. "There are those among us who believe the British Empire has overstayed its welcome. They believe the world has changed and it's time for the old powers to fall. We, the ones who operate in the shadows, are ready to help make that happen. The Opal of Wight is just the beginning of our work." Watson's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a quick glance with Holmes. "You're speaking of a revolution, Patel. A rebellion that goes beyond anything we've seen in the colonies. You mean to overthrow the Empire itself." Patel's eyes gleamed with a dangerous, quiet intensity. "Precisely, but not through brute force alone. We have a different plan. A plan that involves more than just rebellion. It's about creating a new world order where the old powers crumble under the weight of their own greed and corruption." Holmes absorbed this with his usual meticulousness, but Watson could see the flicker of concern in his eyes. He had suspected there was more at stake than just a stolen gem, but hearing Patel speak so openly of a global conspiracy made the situation all the more dire. "I still don't understand," Watson pressed. "How does the Opal fit into this grand plan of yours? What role does it play?" Patel's grin returned, though it was now colder, more calculating. "The Opal is a symbol, a key, as you called it. It's a rare gem, yes, but it holds much more value than you realize. It has been passed through the hands of powerful men for centuries. It's the key to an ancient trust, one that holds the fortune of an entire network, men and women who have been operating in secrecy for generations. We've all played our parts, and now, with the Opal, we can secure the resources needed to push forward our cause." Holmes was silent for a moment, turning over Patel's words in his mind. The pieces were starting to fit, but there was still much that didn't quite add up. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this fortune, Patel? You speak of an empire that will fall, but you've still not explained how any of this benefits you or your associates." Patel shrugged nonchalantly, though the sharpness in his eyes betrayed a hint of emotion beneath his calm demeanor. "The money and power are simply tools, Holmes. The true goal is to shift the balance of power, to create a world where we are no longer ruled by the old empires. The Opal will fund the movement. It will open doors, give us access to people who are in positions of power, men who can influence governments, control trade, and yes, even military operations. It's not just about wealth, it's about control. There was a long pause as Holmes absorbed the full scope of Patel's words. Watson could feel the weight of the conversation bearing down on them both. The stakes were far higher than they had imagined. This was no longer just a matter of recovering a stolen gem. They were now entangled in a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of the British Empire. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice as cold and calculated as ever. "So you're telling me that the Opal of Wight is not just a valuable gem, but a token of something far more dangerous. You intend to use it as a means to finance a global conspiracy that seeks to tear down the empire." Patel's grin widened, and his eyes sparkled with a dangerous, almost manic intensity. "Exactly, Holmes. You're starting to understand. But it's too late. You've already stepped into the web, and there's no way out now. You won't be able to stop us. We've already set everything in motion." Holmes, unshaken, leaned forward slightly. "I disagree, Patel. I've only just begun to understand the true nature of your plans. And I will stop you, no matter how many shadows you hide behind or how many men you have in your employ." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, their silent battle of wills hanging heavy in the air. Watson, ever the observer, knew that this was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. They weren't dealing with mere thieves or opportunists. They were facing a group that was determined to reshape the world. Patel finally broke the silence, his smile now replaced by a look of calculation. "We shall see, Holmes. We shall see. But remember, there is much more at play here than just you and your precious empire. The wheels are already turning, and there's nothing you can do to stop them." Holmes's eyes hardened. "We'll see about that, Patel. We'll see." With that, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Holmes turned on his heel, his coat swirling around him as he motioned for Watson to follow. Watson hesitated for just a moment, but the weight of the situation was undeniable. As they exited the tavern, the oppressive fog clung to them once more, hiding the faces of the men in the streets. The game was far from over, but it had certainly taken a dangerous turn. Holmes had always prided himself on his ability to uncover the truth, but now as he stepped back into the mist, even he couldn't deny the magnitude of the conspiracy they had just uncovered. The world, it seemed, was on the brink of a seismic shift, and Holmes and Watson had just stepped into the heart of it. Chapter 14. The Shadows Grow Darker. The cold, early morning fog clung to the streets of London, suffocating the air and obscuring the world in a ghostly veil. Holmes and Watson made their way to Baker Street, the silence between them only interrupted by the rhythmic tap of Holmes's cane on the cobblestone road. Their thoughts were heavy with the conversation they'd just had with Patel, whose cryptic words echoed in their minds like a distant drumbeat. Watson walked just a few paces behind, his eyes scanning the street, his mind replaying every detail of their meeting with the enigmatic merchant. Holmes, however, was deep in thought, his face impassive, lost in the intricacies of what Patel had revealed. Finally, Watson broke the silence. "Holmes," he began, his voice steady but edged with concern, "what do you make of it all? Patel's words, his claim of a greater conspiracy? Do you truly believe that the Opal of Wight holds the key to something so vast? Could it really be a symbol of this so-called movement against the Empire?" Holmes did not immediately respond, his mind still sifting through the new information they had uncovered. He continued walking, the fog swirling around him like a cloak. At last, he spoke, his voice calm, though with an underlying intensity. "I've been involved in many cases, Watson, but none quite like this. Patel is no fool. What he said may sound fantastical, even impossible, but there's something in the way he spoke, something about the urgency in his eyes that tells me his words should not be dismissed so easily." "Then you think there is more to this than a mere theft?" Watson asked. Holmes nodded. "Yes, I do. The opal is not simply valuable because of its rarity. It has a history, a long one. And that history seems to be entwined with the undercurrents of power, both in the colonies and here at home. It's not just about a jewel. It's about what it represents, a key to a network that spans continents, a force capable of influencing not just finances, but governments." "Do you believe the rebellion is already in motion, as Patel suggested?" Watson pressed. It may well be, Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing as he studied the fog ahead. What Patel fails to understand, however, is that there are too many threads in this web for him to control them all. There are more powerful forces at play, ones he likely does not even see. His movements, while dangerous, are not entirely without oversight. Watson's thoughts began to churn as he digested this new perspective. But we don't know where to look next. Patel may have been willing to speak to us, but what of the others involved? The men behind this operation, how far do their tendrils reach? Holmes stopped suddenly, his gaze snapping to Watson. That, Watson, is precisely what we must find out. The two men entered Baker Street, the warmth of the fire awaiting them a stark contrast to the chill of the morning air. Holmes wasted no time in setting down his cane and coat, moving quickly to his desk, where a set of papers and a map of London were already laid out. Watson, following his lead, took a seat, feeling the weight of their conversation sink in. We must begin by identifying those who may be complicit in Patel's scheme, Holmes murmured, almost to himself. But we also need to understand the motivations of these men. This is no simple matter of theft or rebellion. There is something more profound at work, something that ties these events together. He picked up the map, his finger tracing along the streets of London, eventually coming to a stop near the docks. There is a place, Holmes continued, his voice gaining strength, where money changes hands in the shadows, far from the public eye. I believe the key to unraveling this conspiracy lies there. Watson raised an eyebrow. The docks? But what of the jewel merchant? Stewart, was it? He seemed to know more than he was letting on. Should we not pay him another visit? Holmes's lips curled into a small smile. Stewart is a pawn in this game, Watson. He has knowledge, yes, but I doubt it extends as far as he believes. The true players are far more subtle. The docks, however, represent an area where deals are made, often with far-reaching consequences. And it is there that I believe we may find the next piece of the puzzle. The detective stood abruptly, as though his mind had already moved on to the next phase of their investigation. We must act quickly. Time is of the essence. Patel may be in hiding, but his associates are not. We need to find those who are moving the pieces behind the scenes. As Holmes gathered his things, Watson followed suit, grabbing his coat and hat. The air outside was still thick with fog, the streets eerily quiet. The journey to the docks would take them into the heart of London's underworld, an area where danger lurked in every shadow, and few were willing to venture unless they had no other choice. As they made their way through the foggy streets, Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the scattered clues they had gathered so far. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the task at hand. The conspiracy they were up against was vast, and its threads stretched far beyond what either of them had initially suspected. When they reached the docks, the scene was exactly as Holmes had expected. The air smelled of salt and oil, and the distant sound of water slapping against the hulls of ships filled the otherwise quiet space. The docks were a labyrinth of warehouses, each more dilapidated than the last, and filled with men who lived on the fringes of society, peddling goods both legal and illicit. Holmes stopped for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "Watson," he said quietly, "keep your wits about you. We are not alone here." They made their way deeper into the maze of buildings, where the narrow alleys were lit only by the occasional flicker of a lantern. Holmes led the way, moving with practiced ease, his senses attuned to every sound and shadow. Watson followed closely behind, feeling the weight of their mission pressing down on him. They came to a stop in front of a particularly decrepit warehouse, its door slightly ajar. Holmes gestured for Watson to remain silent as he pushed the door open slowly. The interior was dim, with only a few scattered beams of light illuminating the dusty air. Inside, they could hear hushed voices, muffled by the thick walls of the warehouse. Holmes moved stealthily, his eyes scanning the room. At the far end, several men were gathered around a table, their low voices rising in intensity as they exchanged papers and small packages. Holmes motioned for Watson to stay back as he approached the group. They were too focused on their business to notice his presence, and Holmes took advantage of their distraction. As he edged closer, a few words became clear, enough to send a shiver down his spine. "We have the money," one of the men said, his voice heavy with a foreign accent. "But the opal must be delivered soon, or the consequences will be irreversible." Holmes's eyes flicked to Watson, and without a word, they silently retreated into the shadows. This was just the beginning. They had uncovered the first of many layers in this conspiracy, but it was clear that the path ahead would not be an easy one. As they left the warehouse, Holmes's mind raced with new possibilities. The opal, it seemed, was not just a symbol of wealth or power. It was the linchpin of a far-reaching conspiracy, one that threatened to change the course of history. And Holmes, as always, would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The fog had thickened even more as Holmes and Watson emerged from the shadowy alley, their footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. The distant hum of the city's heart seemed muffled here, as if the thick mist had somehow shielded the world beyond from their discoveries. Holmes' brow furrowed as he pulled his coat tighter, his mind still racing over the words spoken in that dim-lit warehouse. Every utterance had been like a key turning in the lock of an ever-growing mystery. The opal must be delivered soon, or the consequences will be irreversible. The words echoed through his mind. But what consequences? And who was they? The implications were starting to make a terrifying amount of sense, more so with each new piece of information they uncovered. As they made their way back toward the relative safety of Baker Street, Watson remained silent, his mind also preoccupied with the shadowy figures they had observed in the warehouse. A dozen questions clouded his thoughts. Who were the men they had seen inside? What was the significance of the opal in these dealings? And most pressing of all, who stood behind this conspiracy? Who was orchestrating it all? Once inside Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. The air inside their home, though warmer, felt charged with the tension that had built over the last few days. Watson sat by the fire, watching as Holmes removed his gloves and coat with an urgency that suggested the pace of the investigation was only going to quicken. Holmes turned to him. "Watson, the web is growing more complex. I feel we're circling a deeper truth, one that involves far more than the opal itself." "Then what is it? What is it that these men are truly after?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Holmes stood still for a moment, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "They are not just after the jewel, Watson. That opal, as rare and valuable as it is, represents far more than a mere object of desire. It's a symbol of rebellion, of a fractured empire, and of a power struggle. The words irreversible consequences suggest that if this opal is not delivered to its intended destination, the repercussions won't just be personal. They'll be political, perhaps even global in scale." Watson stood up and crossed the room, his hands resting on the back of a chair. "A rebellion? You think this opal is connected to something of that magnitude?" "Precisely." Holmes's voice was steady, though the intensity of his thoughts was evident. He turned toward the window, staring out into the London fog. "This opal is not merely an item to be sold in a backstreet auction or traded between shady merchants. It is an asset, a symbol of something greater, a movement designed to undermine the empire's hold on the colonies." Watson could feel the weight of his words settle in. But why would men in such positions, these financiers, these shadows at the docks, use a simple jewel to fuel a rebellion? Surely there's more to it than that. Holmes finally turned back to face Watson, his eyes gleaming with the fire of discovery. The opal is more than a jewel. It's the key to the secretive network of power brokers working against the empire. The men at the docks, the ones we saw today, are likely only a part of a far more intricate operation, involving financiers, ex-colonial officers, and foreign agents. "I see," Watson murmured, nodding slowly. "A symbol, a rallying point. So it's not just about taking the opal for its intrinsic value, but about what it represents." Holmes nodded in agreement. Yes, the rebellion, the movement, it all revolves around this singular object. And if they fail to deliver the opal, Watson, everything they've worked for could fall apart. That's why it's so vital to them, and that's why we must stop it. The detective paused, his sharp gaze never leaving Watson's face. But the question remains, who is behind this conspiracy? We've seen the men in the warehouse, but they are just intermediaries. We need to find the ones pulling the strings, the ones financing this operation. "Do you have a theory?" Watson asked, his curiosity piqued. I have a few ideas, but no solid proof yet. Holmes picked up a few papers from his desk, his eyes scanning the notes he'd compiled over the past few days. The merchant Stewart, though his knowledge is limited, may have been closer to these players than he realizes. We've yet to explore his connections fully. Watson raised an eyebrow. But you think there's someone more dangerous behind him? Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile. Always. In matters of such magnitude, there are always figures operating in the shadows, figures who manipulate the system from behind the curtain. Stewart may have been merely the messenger, but we need to look deeper. There's something more to his operation, something tied to the East End, where money, both legitimate and illicit, finds its way into the right hands. But what if Stewart himself is one of those shadows? Watson asked, his mind working quickly. What if he is more involved than we think? Holmes gave a brief, thoughtful nod. It's possible, but we cannot dismiss the notion that he, too, may be being controlled by someone else, perhaps someone we've yet to identify. Either way, he's a piece of the puzzle. Our job is to figure out where he fits. The room fell silent for a moment as both men considered the magnitude of the task ahead of them. Holmes was already mentally assembling the next steps of their investigation. Patience, as always, was required, but so too was swiftness. They could not afford to wait too long. Finally, Holmes spoke again, his voice taking on a quieter, more deliberate tone. We must pay Stewart another visit, and this time, Watson, we must tread more carefully. There are too many secrets that lie beneath the surface. We need answers, and I believe Stewart holds the key to unlocking them. Watson nodded, his own resolve firming as he understood the stakes. When do we leave? Holmes turned to face him with a look of determination. Now, Watson. The longer we wait, the closer they get to completing their plan. It's time to make our move. The two men gathered their coats and hats, ready to leave the confines of Baker Street once more. The night had fallen, and the fog seemed even more oppressive now, wrapping the streets of London in a blanket of secrecy. As they ventured back out into the labyrinthine streets of the city, Holmes's mind buzzed with possibilities. The opal was only the first clue in a far-reaching conspiracy, one that threatened to shake the very foundations of the empire itself. Every shadow they encountered, every piece of information they uncovered, seemed to only deepen the mystery. But Holmes was determined. They had come too far to turn back now. The truth, no matter how dark or elusive, was within their reach, and Holmes would stop at nothing to bring it into the light. As they approached Stewart's shop once again, Holmes glanced at Watson, his expression resolute. We shall see what secrets he is hiding, whether he's the key to this entire operation or simply another player caught in its web. And with that, they stepped into the heart of the mystery once more, ready to confront whatever dangers awaited them in the shadows. Chapter 15. A Web of Lies. The evening air was thick with fog, the London streets shrouded in an almost impenetrable haze that seemed to swallow everything around them. Holmes and Watson walked side by side through the cobbled alleys, their footsteps barely audible as they made their way toward the East End. The streets here were a far cry from the more genteel areas of London they were accustomed to, where the clatter of carriages and the hum of voices filled the air. Here, the silence was broken only by the occasional sound of a dog barking in the distance, or the soft rustling of papers carried by the wind. The air was colder now, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, the further they ventured into the darker corners of the city. Holmes's face, usually so expressive, was set in a mask of concentration, his eyes scanning the environment for any clues that might provide answers to the mystery they were piecing together. Watson, ever the loyal companion, kept a close watch on their surroundings, his instincts telling him that the danger was ever present, even in the quietest of moments. They reached the narrow, winding street that led to the back of Stewart's shop. Holmes stopped in front of the dimly lit building, his eyes narrowing as he observed the surroundings. "We must be cautious now," he murmured, more to himself than to Watson. "Stewart has become more than just a simple merchant. He is a man entangled in something much larger than himself." Watson glanced up at the shop, its windows shuttered and its door slightly ajar. A flicker of light from within cast long shadows onto the street outside. It's as if the whole place is holding its breath, Watson said, his voice low. Do you think Stewart is hiding something from us? I'm certain of it, Holmes replied. But the question remains, is he hiding it for himself or for someone else? That's what we need to find out. The two men exchanged a brief look of understanding before Holmes, with his usual precision, pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. Inside, the shop was as they had left it, dimly lit, with rows of shelves filled with various curiosities and trinkets. The air smelled faintly of incense and dust, a testament to the hours Stewart must have spent curating his collection. Holmes moved quietly toward the back of the shop, his eyes flicking to every corner, every shelf, as if the very walls might hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. Watson followed, his hand resting on the handle of his walking stick, though he knew better than to draw attention to himself in a place like this. They reached the small door that led to the back office, and Holmes gave a silent nod to Watson. He knocked 3 times, the sound sharp and deliberate. They waited, but there was no response. Holmes knocked again, this time with more urgency. Still, nothing. Stewart must be inside, Holmes muttered, his brow furrowing in thought. Perhaps he's expecting us to find him, or perhaps he's simply trying to avoid us. Without another word, Holmes tried the door. It was unlocked. The 2 men stepped inside. The office was small and cluttered, papers strewn across the desk and floor, as though someone had been rifling through them in haste. A single oil lamp flickered in the corner, casting a dim light over the scene. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and ink, and a chill seemed to hang in the atmosphere. Holmes immediately moved to the desk, his fingers skimming over the papers, examining each one with the meticulous attention to detail that only he could muster. Watson, meanwhile, took in the room's other features. The small window covered with heavy curtains, the locked drawer in the desk, the cracked mirror on the wall. Everything seemed ordinary at first glance, but there was a certain disarray here, a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Holmes, Watson said quietly, his voice tense. Do you think he's gone? Stewart. I mean, he's not here, and this mess. This doesn't look like something someone would leave behind if they were just going out for a quick errand. Holmes didn't respond at first, his gaze focused intently on the documents before him. Finally, he looked up, his eyes sharp. You're right, Watson. This is not the work of someone who left in a hurry. Someone has been searching through these papers, and Stewart is nowhere to be found. It seems he's taken some precautions, but we've yet to uncover his true intentions. Holmes leaned forward, sifting through the papers with increasing urgency. After a moment, he paused. One particular document caught his eye, its edges worn and creased, as though it had been handled repeatedly. It was a letter, though the ink had smudged in several places, making it difficult to read. Holmes squinted at the text, his mind working quickly to piece together the meaning of the words. What is it, Holmes? Watson asked, his curiosity piqued. This letter, Holmes said, his voice low. It seems to be a correspondence between Stewart and someone named A. The letter speaks of a meeting, an exchange. But what is most curious is the mention of the package, the same one we've been tracking for days. It's clear that Stewart is involved in something far more nefarious than we could have imagined. He handed the letter to Watson, who took it and read through the jumbled text. It's mostly illegible, Watson observed, but the references to a package are unmistakable. And this A, do you think it's the person behind all of this? I have no doubt, Holmes replied. But we must learn more about this A. The question now is how to find Stewart and confront him with these new revelations. Suddenly, there was a faint noise from the hallway outside, a creak of a floorboard followed by the faint sound of footsteps. Holmes and Watson froze, their eyes meeting. A shadow passed under the door, and they both instinctively stepped away from the desk, slipping into the dark corner of the room. The door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, his face obscured by the dim light from the hallway. He was dressed in a dark coat, his posture tense and alert. In one hand, he carried a large envelope, and in the other, a small revolver glinted menacingly. I knew someone would come, the man said, his voice low and cold. I just didn't expect it to be you, Sherlock Holmes. Holmes stood frozen, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. Watson instinctively reached for his stick, but Holmes signaled him to remain calm. "And I knew someone would be waiting for me, but I did not expect you to be so bold," Holmes replied, his voice steady. "Who are you, and what is your connection to Stuart?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile, revealing a faint trace of amusement. "My name is not important. What matters is that Stuart has become a liability. He has something we need, and I intend to make sure he doesn't speak to anyone else about it." With that, the man stepped forward, the revolver raised, and for the first time in many years, Holmes felt the cold chill of danger creeping up his spine. "This is where your investigation ends, Holmes." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Not if I can help it." Before either man could make a move, the door slammed shut behind them with a loud bang, and the world outside faded into darkness. The room fell silent, save for the faint thrum of Watson's heartbeat and the steady, controlled breath of Sherlock Holmes. The man at the door, still holding the revolver with an unwavering grip, stood poised like a predator cornering its prey. His eyes glinted with the sort of calm determination that suggested he had been in far more dangerous situations than Holmes could possibly imagine. But Holmes was not a man easily intimidated. "Put the weapon down," Holmes said, his voice carrying an edge of cold authority. "You do not want to make a mistake here." The man's eyes flickered for a moment, uncertainty crossing his expression. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. He glanced at Watson, who had instinctively stepped closer to Holmes, his walking stick gripped tightly in his hands. Watson, ever the loyal companion, was prepared to back his friend, though the dire nature of the situation made his fingers tremble slightly. "Do you really think you can talk your way out of this, Holmes?" the man asked, his voice low, almost amused. "You may be the great detective of London, but I know how to deal with men like you." Holmes didn't flinch. He didn't back away. Instead, he stepped toward the man slowly, as if the revolver were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I'm not the one in danger, am I? You are. You see, the trouble with you is that you underestimate me, and that is always a fatal mistake. Do you think I haven't already anticipated this encounter?" The man's hand tightened on the revolver, and for a fleeting moment, Holmes thought the weapon might be discharged, but then the man lowered it ever so slightly. Holmes pressed the advantage. "Who are you?" Holmes asked again, his voice crisp and insistent. "Who do you work for? I would like to hear your side of the story." The man hesitated, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he struggled with the decision of whether or not to speak. It was a standoff, and the atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. "I work for people who know far more than you ever will, Holmes," the man finally said, his voice dark with a veiled threat. "And you should have stayed out of this. But now you've gone and made a mess of everything." A sudden noise outside the office, the sound of hurried footsteps, broke the silence. The man stiffened, his hand jerking up instinctively to point the revolver toward the door. Holmes, ever perceptive, noticed the change in his posture and deduced that someone else was about to join them. Someone with even more power or influence than the man standing before him. A moment later, the door opened wide, and a second figure stepped inside, this one cloaked in a heavy overcoat, the fabric shimmering under the dim light. The newcomer was tall and commanding, his features sharp and cold. Unlike the man with the revolver, this new figure exuded an air of authority, someone who had seen the workings of the highest circles in society. Holmes' mind raced. It wasn't just a common criminal or a thug trying to stop an investigation. The game had just escalated. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" the newcomer said, his voice smooth but carrying a palpable undercurrent of menace. Holmes didn't flinch, although Watson could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The man had the air of someone who knew how to control a situation. Holmes had been in many predicaments, but something about this moment felt different, more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. "I am Sherlock Holmes, yes," Holmes replied, his tone still calm, but the edge was unmistakable. "And you are?" The man studied Holmes for a long moment before his lips curled into a faint smile. "You've been quite an irritant to my operations, Holmes. All of this, the stolen opal, the deception, the trail you've been following, it was never supposed to reach you. But now, here we are." Holmes stood tall, not yielding to the pressure the man sought to exert. "So it was you. I've been tracing the threads back, but I was certain you were a part of something larger. The opal is just a small piece in the grander puzzle, isn't it?" The man nodded, his expression darkening. "Indeed, the opal is but a symbol, a key, if you will. You've been barking up the wrong tree, Mr. Holmes. You think it's about a gem? A simple theft? No, this is about power, influence, and the future of this empire." The cold realization dawned on Holmes, and the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The conspiracy was far more intricate than even he had imagined. This wasn't just about jewels or money. It was about something far more dangerous, a rebellion in the making. The opal had been smuggled in, not for its beauty, but as a financial tool, a way to fund a movement that could shake the very foundations of the British Empire. "Rebellion?" Watson interjected, his voice a mixture of confusion and shock. "You mean you're financing insurgents?" The man didn't even flinch at the question, his gaze steely. "Yes, Dr. Watson, though I'm not certain your understanding extends far enough to grasp the full scope. This isn't simply about insurgents in India. This is a much broader operation, and you are in the midst of it now." Holmes raised an eyebrow, intrigued yet unfazed. "And where does Stewart fit into all of this?" The man's lips twitched, the hint of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Stewart? Oh, Stewart is nothing more than a pawn, a merchant caught in the tides of larger affairs. But he has something I need, something very valuable." "And what is that exactly?" Holmes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The man stepped forward, his movements calculated, deliberate. "Stewart holds a ledger, a record of transactions that would reveal the full scale of our operations. If he speaks, the entire conspiracy could unravel. That is why he has to be silenced." Before Holmes could respond, a sudden movement caught his eye. The man with the revolver, who had been standing silently until now, moved swiftly toward the door, his hand poised to lock it. Holmes' mind worked furiously as he weighed his options. The situation was precarious, to say the least. There was no escaping through the door. The only route was through the narrow, winding back passageway that led to the street. But the moment they tried to move, they would be met with resistance, and any attempt at violence would escalate the danger. "Let me make one thing clear," Holmes said, his voice steady, though there was an intensity to it that commanded attention. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. I will expose this entire scheme, and when I do, you'll find there is no place in the Empire where you can hide." The man's gaze narrowed, and for a moment a flicker of doubt seemed to cross his expression. But the moment passed. "We'll see about that, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice dripping with cold amusement. "But for now, you and your friend will stay right where you are. I wouldn't want to see anything untoward happen to you." A tense silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken threats. Holmes stood unmoving, his mind calculating, his fingers twitching as he weighed his options. Watson, too, was ready for action, his heart pounding in his chest. This was no longer just a simple case of theft. It was a matter of national security, and it was about to get far more dangerous. The clock was ticking, and Holmes knew they were running out of time. Chapter 16, The Opal's End. The final act of the case, like all of Holmes's most thrilling investigations, unfolded with a combination of subtlety, danger, and the razor-sharp brilliance of his deductive mind. The tension in the room was palpable. The revelation of the conspiracy had shifted everything. The jewel theft was merely a gateway to a far darker and more intricate plot. Holmes had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this felt different, more dangerous, more personal. For the first time in their long partnership, Watson could see the faint flicker of a deeper danger in Holmes's eyes. The man who had been so calm, so assured, now stood in front of them, clearly calculating his next move. His eyes darted between Holmes, Watson, and the closed door. The situation had changed, and they both knew it. The stakes were higher, and the shadow of impending violence loomed ever closer. "We are not going to let you escape with this, you know," Holmes said softly, but with such authority that the room seemed to shrink in response. "It's over. You may believe yourself to be untouchable, but I assure you, you are not. You underestimated me, and that will be your undoing." The man's hand twitched toward the revolver again, but he paused, eyes narrowing. The fleeting doubt that had crossed his features earlier was now gone. In its place was a new resolve, cold and unyielding. He wasn't going to let them escape this time. Holmes's mind raced. If there was one thing he knew, it was that violence often came from desperation. The man was cornered, and like all desperate creatures, he would strike quickly. But Holmes wasn't interested in a fight. He needed to find a way to turn the tables without escalating the situation. "You're making a mistake," Holmes continued, his voice calm and steady. "You see, I already know everything I need to know. I know you're not the real mastermind behind this operation. You're just a cog in a much larger machine. The question is, who else is involved?" The man blinked, a flash of hesitation crossing his face. Holmes saw the flicker, the momentary crack in the facade. That was all he needed. Before the man could respond, Watson, who had been watching the exchange with growing apprehension, stepped forward cautiously. He knew Holmes well enough to recognize that a confrontation was inevitable, but if there was any hope of diffusing it, now was the moment. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice firm but not confrontational, "perhaps it's time we reconsider our approach. There's no point in pushing him any further. We need to understand who is truly behind this, and it's clear this man is only a part of a larger scheme. Maybe we can negotiate?" But Holmes cut him off, his eyes never leaving the man who stood before them. "There is no negotiating with people like him, Watson. Don't you see? This is much bigger than a mere theft. This is about a rebellion funded by some of the most influential people in the empire. The opal is nothing more than a symbol, a tool used to finance a movement that could tear apart the very fabric of our society." The man flinched at the mention of the rebellion, his expression faltering for just a moment. Holmes caught it immediately. The truth was spilling out now, and there was no stopping it. "You see," Holmes continued, his voice now filled with a sharp bite of certainty, "the opal was never just a jewel. It was a message. You were trying to get it into the hands of your accomplices, those who would use it to fund a movement to destabilize the empire. I've been following your trail, and every step I've taken has brought me closer to understanding the scale of your operation. And now I know everything. About you, about the ledger, about your mysterious benefactors." The man's grip on the revolver tightened, but Holmes could see the uncertainty creeping back into his eyes. The truth was unraveling before him, and it was clear he had underestimated Holmes. But he still had the power. He could still silence them both with a single pull of the trigger. "I won't let you stop this," the man hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You can't stop what's already in motion. It's too late for you, Holmes. And it's too late for the Empire." "Is it?" Holmes said, his voice rising slightly. "The pieces are already in place. The rebellion you're trying to fund won't happen. And you," he pointed a finger at the man, "are going to lead me straight to the ones pulling the strings." The man's face twisted in anger, but Holmes's words had struck a nerve. With an almost imperceptible movement, he slowly lowered the revolver, but not before shooting one last venomous glance at Holmes. "You're a fool, Holmes. If you think you can stop this, you're gravely mistaken." Before the man could say more, there was a sudden, forceful knock at the door. The three men in the room froze, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Holmes's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to the man with the revolver. There was a brief moment of confusion, but then the man moved swiftly, his hand reaching for the door. With a quick motion, he opened it just enough to reveal another figure standing in the hallway. A man dressed in an elegant black coat, his dark eyes calculating and full of purpose, stepped inside the room. He glanced at the scene before him, his gaze flicking from the man with the revolver to Holmes and Watson. He was tall, his posture rigid, and there was an air of danger about him, one that seemed to radiate from his very presence. "Enough," the man said, his voice low but commanding. "You've done well, my associate, but it's time to end this charade. Mr. Holmes, I presume?" His gaze shifted to Holmes, and the detective knew immediately that this was the true mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the entire plot. Holmes remained silent for a moment, studying the man carefully. Then he spoke, his voice sharp and deliberate. "You're the one behind the opal. I've been waiting to meet you." The man smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. "You've been quite an inconvenience, Mr. Holmes. I had hoped you would remain content with your petty investigations and leave matters of true importance to those who understand the stakes." Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile of his own. "It is never wise to underestimate me. I've seen the web you've woven, and it is now time for you to face the consequences." The man's smile faltered for the briefest moment, and that was all Holmes needed to know. The game had shifted once again. The Opal, the rebellion, the people behind it all, everything had come to this point. The man standing before him was the keystone of the conspiracy, and Holmes was ready to bring it all to an end. "You're under arrest," Holmes said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The man's eyes flashed with fury, but before he could react, Holmes's hand shot out. In a blur of motion, he grasped the man's wrist and twisted it, causing the revolver to fall from his hand. The man staggered back, his expression contorted with rage, but Holmes wasn't done yet. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Holmes knew what he had to do next. He turned toward Watson, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, and nodded. "Watson, now." Without hesitation, Watson sprang into action, his walking stick a blur as he struck the man squarely in the chest, sending him sprawling back toward the corner. The other man, the one with the revolver, made a desperate move, but it was too late. Holmes was already upon him, swiftly disarming him and pinning him to the ground. The room was filled with chaos, but amidst it all, Holmes remained calm. He knew that the true challenge lay ahead, getting this entire operation to unravel, one thread at a time. Hours later, Scotland Yard had arrived to take the criminals into custody. The operation, Holmes knew, was far from over. But this was the final piece, the end of the trail that had begun with a stolen opal and ended with a conspiracy to destabilize an empire. As Holmes and Watson stood in the quiet aftermath of the night's events, the detective turned to his friend with a satisfied look on his face. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, his voice light but edged with the satisfaction of a case well solved, "I believe this is the end of the Opal of Wight case. But as we both know, there's always another adventure around the corner." Watson smiled, his ever-faithful companion. "Indeed, Holmes. Always another one." As the two men walked into the darkened streets of London, the sound of their footsteps echoed through the night, fading into the distance, but the mystery of the Opal of Wight was finally laid to rest, and with it, the shadow of rebellion that had threatened to tear the empire apart, for now. As Holmes and Watson walked down the dimly lit street, the cool London air carried a hint of dampness from the mist creeping in from the river. The sound of their footsteps reverberated on the cobblestones, mingling with the faint hum of the city that never quite slept. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, and for the first time since the case had begun, there was a rare sense of finality in the air. Holmes, as usual, was deep in thought, his keen mind already several steps ahead. Watson, who had come to recognize that look, knew his companion wasn't simply reflecting on the events of the evening. Holmes was already analyzing the implications of the conspiracy that had been uncovered. The rebellion, the shadowy figures behind it, the ruthless ambition of those who sought to disrupt the empire, it all felt like a small piece of a larger, more dangerous puzzle. "Holmes," Watson ventured, breaking the silence, "what do you suppose will come of all this? The rebellion they spoke of, do you think it will truly end now?" Holmes gave a slight, enigmatic smile. "Rebellions, Watson, like all movements, do not end merely because a few figures are captured. The cause, once planted, will continue to grow in the minds of others. The opal may have been the financial catalyst for this scheme, but the ideals behind it have existed for far longer, and I dare say they will not simply vanish into thin air." "But we've uncovered the men behind the operation. Surely that will be enough to stop it from spreading." "Yes, but the root of the issue lies deeper than a few schemers and conspirators. It is the ideals of rebellion, the desire for change, that will continue to take hold, no matter how many criminals we imprison. If history has taught us anything, it is that these ideas will always find a way to rise again, perhaps not in the same form, but certainly in another." Watson nodded slowly, processing Holmes's words. They were the kind of statements that always lingered long after the case was closed, the kind that made one question not just the specific details of the case, but the larger, ongoing story of the world itself. "Then, what now?" Watson asked after a long silence. Holmes turned to him, his sharp eyes gleaming with a mixture of weariness and resolve. "Now, Watson, we return to Baker Street. There is always work to be done. New mysteries, new puzzles. Perhaps another case awaits us, or perhaps the quiet will persist for a while, but I suspect that before long we will be caught up in another conundrum. The world is full of them." The two men continued their walk, the conversation fading as they approached 221B Baker Street. As they reached the doorstep, Holmes stopped, turning to Watson with a rare but genuine expression of gratitude. "You've been an invaluable help throughout this case, Watson. I admit that there were moments when I feared I was missing something, some crucial detail, but your steady presence and observations have been precisely what I needed to keep my focus." Watson smiled, a bit sheepishly. "I merely followed your lead, Holmes. Your mind is the one that has truly unraveled all of this." Holmes inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in Watson's words, but unwilling to make much of it. "All the same, I appreciate it. Now, let us see what awaits us next." They ascended the stairs to their apartment, where the familiar comforts of Baker Street awaited them. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The familiar scent of tobacco and books lingered in the air. As Holmes removed his coat and settled into his armchair, Watson moved to the desk, where a stack of newspapers and letters sat, waiting to be perused. Holmes looked over at him. "Do you ever tire of it, Watson? Of the endless mysteries? Or does it excite you still?" Watson looked up, his face thoughtful. "It does, Holmes. There's always something new. Always a challenge. But it's not just the cases that excite me. It's being by your side when you solve them. I've learned more from you than I ever thought possible." Holmes smiled again, though his smile was tempered by a quiet sadness that Watson knew too well. There was a part of Holmes that lived for the thrill of the chase, the sharp satisfaction of solving an intricate puzzle. But there was also a part of him that sought something deeper, something beyond the immediate solution, beyond the momentary triumph. Watson had always suspected that Holmes sought not just answers to mysteries, but answers to the deeper questions of life itself. "I appreciate your companionship, Watson. More than you know," Holmes said, his voice low, the words seeming to hang in the air for a moment longer than usual. Watson met his gaze and nodded, understanding the unspoken sentiment between them. They spent the rest of the evening in silence, the glow of the fire flickering in the background as Holmes occasionally scribbled notes in his casebook. The Opal of Wight was no longer a mystery, and the web of rebellion that had been uncovered would soon be dismantled. But for Holmes, the case was far from over. The implications of what had transpired, the people behind it, and the future of the empire weighed heavily on his mind. As the night wore on and the hour grew late, Holmes closed his casebook with a finality that signified the end of one chapter. But Watson knew, just as he always did, that Holmes's mind was already turning toward the next challenge. There would always be another case, another puzzle, and Holmes would always be there to solve it. It was a relentless cycle, but one that Watson had come to embrace. For in that pursuit of truth, of justice, of solving the unsolvable, there was a sense of purpose, one that neither of them could deny. And so, as the gas lamps of London flickered outside the windows of 221B Baker Street, Holmes and Watson knew that though one mystery had been solved, the adventure was far from over. Far from over. The quiet moments between cases were simply a prelude to the next great challenge that would surely come their way. For the world was full of mysteries, and Sherlock Holmes would always be there to solve them. The Opal of Wight was but one of many treasures lost and found. The chase would continue, and so too would the bond between Holmes and Watson. The adventure never truly ended, it only evolved, and so the final chapter of this case came to a close, but the story of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson would never truly be finished. The world was full of mysteries, and they were just getting started. Epilogue. Nearly a year had passed since the events surrounding the Opal of Wight and the unraveling of the conspiracy that threatened to destabilize the empire. London had returned to its usual rhythm, the streets bustling with the familiar hum of life, carriages clattering on cobblestones, the chatter of shopkeepers and customers, the distant clink of church bells calling out the hour. And yet, in the quiet corners of Baker Street, life had taken on a different kind of peace. Dr. John Watson, now well accustomed to the ebb and flow of the cases that occasionally interrupted the calm, sat in his chair by the fire, a book in hand. The crackling sound of the hearth was the only noise in the room, save for the occasional rustle of paper as Watson turned the page. The once dreaded silence between cases had become something more, an opportunity to reflect, to savor the moments of stillness that they were so rarely afforded. Sherlock Holmes, of course, was not one for idle contemplation. He had resumed his experiments, his writings, and the quiet yet diligent work of his investigations. Though there had been no case as grand as the theft of the opal, Holmes was always keen to discover the next puzzle, whether it be a peculiar poisoning, a missing person, or the unexplained disappearance of a small shipment of rare artifacts. The world, it seemed, was constantly offering up new riddles for him to solve. But it was a particular morning, crisp with the promise of an early spring, when the knock came at the door, the knock that had grown all too familiar over the years. Watson, accustomed to such interruptions, set his book aside and rose to answer. He found Inspector Lestrade waiting on the doorstep, his brow furrowed in that particular way he always wore when he had something of importance to discuss. "Holmes is in his study?" Lestrade asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. "Yes," Watson replied, stepping aside to allow the inspector in. "What brings you here this morning?" Lestrade's expression was more serious than usual, and as he stepped into the familiar confines of Baker Street, Watson noticed the slightly hurried manner in which the inspector moved. He wasn't often one to show unease, but today there was something different. "It's about the opal, Watson," Lestrade said quietly, his gaze shifting toward the study door. "There's something you need to know." Watson's heart gave a small lurch, an instinctual reaction to the mention of the case they had thought long closed. He followed Lestrade down the hallway and into the study, where Holmes sat with his violin in hand, playing a soft, contemplative tune. "Lestrade," Holmes greeted without lifting his eyes. "I presume this is not a social call?" "Afraid not, Holmes," Lestrade replied, his tone grave. "I've just returned from a rather unsettling meeting. It seems we missed something important." Holmes raised an eyebrow, setting his violin aside. "You have my full attention, Lestrade. Do go on." Lestrade hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his words. "It's about the Opal of Wight, specifically the man who originally attempted to transport it from India. We were led to believe he had been the victim of a robbery, but, Holmes prompted, his interest piqued. Lestrade's face grew taut. "We've received word from India. It seems that Captain Reynolds, yes, the same man, was never robbed at all. In fact, he had been part of the plot from the very beginning." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, who appeared unsurprised, though his lips curled into a slight smile. "I suspected as much," Holmes muttered under his breath. Lestrade continued. "What we didn't know was that Reynolds had been working with certain individuals in India, high-ranking officials, some connected to rebellion movements that we've only recently started uncovering. The theft of the opal wasn't about the jewel itself. It was a cover-up, a way to divert attention from a much more dangerous operation." "Reynolds was playing both sides," Holmes concluded. "The theft was a diversion, allowing him to smuggle more than just the opal, perhaps documents, or even plans for further rebellion." "Exactly," Lestrade confirmed. "And while we thought we had ended the conspiracy by recovering the opal, it turns out we were only dealing with the surface of the matter. It's much deeper than we realized." Holmes stood up, a spark of interest in his eyes. "I trust that you have gathered the evidence needed to bring Reynolds to justice?" Lestrade looked uncomfortable. "That's the problem, Holmes. Reynolds has vanished. We've tracked him as far as Paris, but after that, we've lost all trace. It seems he has been well prepared, and it's possible that he's in hiding, ready to strike again." For a moment, there was silence in the room, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air. Watson knew better than to question Holmes's ability to solve such a case. It was clear that his mind was already working through the possibilities. But for the first time, there was something almost eerie in the way Holmes seemed to relish the thought of another case to solve. "Well," Holmes said, turning to Watson with a faint smile, "I believe we've been granted another opportunity, my dear friend. I think it's time we embark on a journey to Paris, though I have a feeling this particular case will lead us far beyond its borders." Lestrade nodded gravely. "I knew you'd be up for it, Holmes, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. I'm afraid this case is far from finished." Holmes's sharp eyes gleamed with renewed determination. "Ah, but that's the thing about mysteries, Lestrade. They never truly end, do they? They simply evolve, and where there is a puzzle, there will always be someone ready to solve it." As Watson watched Holmes begin to gather his things, preparing for what would undoubtedly be another thrilling adventure, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe for his friend. There was no end to Sherlock Holmes's hunger for truth, for discovery, and for justice. Each new case, no matter how dangerous or intricate, only seemed to fuel his relentless drive. With the last of the firewood crackling in the hearth, Watson stood, his resolve firm. They would pursue this mystery to the ends of the earth, just as they always did. The world was full of secrets waiting to be uncovered, and Holmes was always one step ahead of those who sought to conceal them. As they made their way out of Baker Street into the cold London night, Watson found himself, as always, eager for the next adventure. It was a life like no other, a life that only Sherlock Holmes could offer. And so, with the closing of another chapter, their story continued. The game was afoot, and the thrill of the chase had once again begun. The end, or rather, as Holmes would say, until the next case. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.